Levin went up to a lamp post and read his brother's address, which he had in his pocketbook, and then hired a sledge on the long way to his brother's. He recalled all the events he knew of Nikolai's life. He recalled how, despite the ridicule of his fellow students, his brother had lived like a monk while at the university, and for a year, after strictly observing all the religious rites, attending service, fasting, avoiding all pleasures and especially women, and then how he suddenly broke loose, became intimate with the vilest people, and gave himself up to unbridled debauchery. He remembered how his brother had brought a boy from the country to educate, and in a fit of anger had so beaten the lad that proceedings were commenced against him for causing bodily harm. He remembered an affair with a sharper to whom his brother had lost money, and whom he had first given a promissory note, and then prosecuted on a charge of fraud. That was when his brother Sergei had paid the money for him. Then he remembered the night which Nikolai had spent in the police cells for disorderly conduct, and the disgraceful proceedings he had instigated against his brother Sergei Ivanitch, whom he accused of not having paid out to him his share of his mother's fortune. And lastly, the time when his brother took an official appointment in one of the western provinces and was there arrested for assaulting an elder. It was all very disgusting, but to Levin it did not seem nearly so disgusting as it must have seemed to those who did not know Nikolai, nor his whole story, nor his heart. Levin remembered that when Nikolai was passing through his pious stage of fasting, visiting monks, and going to church, when he was seeking in religion for help to curb his passionate nature, not only did no one encourage him, but everyone, and Levin among them, made fun of him. He was teased and called Noah and monk, and then when he broke loose, no one helped him, but all turned away from him with horror and disgust. Levin felt that his brother Nikolai, in his soul, in the innermost depths of his soul, despite the depravity of his life, was no worse than those who despise him. It was not his fault that he was born with his ungovernable temper and with a cramped mind. He always wished to do right. I will tell him everything. I will get him to tell me everything. I will show him that I love and therefore understand him. Levin decided in his mind as toward 11 o'clock he drove up to the hotel of which he had the address upstairs. Numbers 12 and 13, said the hall porter in reply to Levin's question. Is he in? I expect so. The door of No. 12 was ajar, and from within, visible in the streak of light, issued dense fumes of inferior and weak tobacco. Levin heard a stranger's voice, but knew at once that his brother was there, for he heard him coughing as he entered the doorway. The stranger's voice was saying, "It all depends on how intelligently and rationally the affair is conducted." Konstantin Levin glanced into the room, which was beyond a partition, and saw that the speaker was a young man with an enormous head of hair who wore a workman's coat, and that a young pockmarked woman in a woolen dress without collar or cuffs was sitting on the sofa. He could not see his brother, and his heart sank painfully at the thought that Nikolai lived among such strange people. No one noticed him, and as he took off his galoshes, he overheard what the man in the workman's coat was saying. He was talking about some commercial enterprise. "Oh, let the privileged classes go to the devil," said his brother's voice with a cough. "Marcia, get us some supper, and bring the wine, if any is left, or send for some." The woman rose, came out from behind the partition, and saw Konstantin. "Here's a gentleman, Nikolai Dmitrich," she said. "Whom do you want?" said Nikolai Levin's voice angrily. "It is I," answered Konstantin Levin, coming forward into the lamplight. "Whose?" I said, the voice of Nikolai Levin, still more angrily. Konstantin heard how he rose hurriedly and caught against something, and then in the doorway before him he saw the familiar yet ever strange figure of his brother, wild, sickly, gigantic, lean, and round-shouldered, with large, frightened eyes. He was even more emaciated than 3 years before, when Konstantin Yevgeny had last seen him. He was wearing a short coat, and his hands and broad bones appeared more immense than ever. His hair was thinner, but the same straight mustache covered his lips, and the same eyes, with their peculiar naive gaze, looked out at the newcomer. "A Gosjar," he said, suddenly recognizing his brother, and his eyes lit up with joy, and at the same moment he turned to look at the young man and convulsively jerked his head and neck as if his necktie was strangling him, a movement Levin knew well, and quite another expression. A wild suffering and cruel look settled on his haggard face. "I wrote both to you and to Sergei Ivanitch that I do Not know you and do not wish to know you. What is it? What do you want? He was not at all as Constantine had imagined him. Constantine, when thinking of him, had forgotten the most trying and worst part of his character, that which made intercourse with him so difficult. But now when he saw his face, and especially that convulsive movement of his head, he remembered it all. I do not want anything of you, especially, he answered meekly. I have simply come to see you. His brother's timidity obviously softened Nikolai, whose lips quivered. Ah, you come just for that, he said. Well, come, and I sit down. Will you have some supper? A marshal get supper for 3. No, wait a little. Do you know who this is? He added, turning to his brother and pointing to the man in the workman's coat. He is Mr. Kredsky, my friend, ever since my Kiev days. A very remarkable fellow. Of course the police are after him, because he's not a scoundrel. And he glanced round at everybody present, as was his way. Seeing that the woman in the doorway was about to go out, he shouted to her, wait, I told you. And in the awkward and blundering manner familiar to Constantine, he again looked round at everybody and began to tell his brother about Kredsky, how he had been expelled from the university because he had started a society to help the poorer students and also Sunday schools, and how he had afterwards taught in an elementary school and had been turned out from that too, and had then been tried on some charge or other. You were at Kiev University? Konstantin Kiev asked Kredsky in order to break the awkward silence that followed. Yes, at Kiev, Kredsky replied with an angry frown. And this woman, said Nikolaeva, interrupting him and pointing to her, is my life's companion, Mari Nikolaevna. I took her out of a house. And as he said this, he again jerked his neck. But I love and respect her and beg all those who wish to know me, he added, raising his voice and scowling, to love and respect her. She's just the same to me as a wife, just the same. So now you know whom you have to deal with. And if you fear you will be degraded, there is the door. And again his eyes glanced questioningly around. Why should I be degraded? I don't understand. Well, Marcia orders supper for 3 with vodka and wine. No, wait, oh no, never mind. You may go. Chapter 25. So you see, Nikolai Yevdin continued with an effort, wrinkling his brow and twitching. He evidently found it hard to decide what to say and to do. Do you see? He pointed to a bundle of iron rods tied together with string in a corner of the room. Do you see that it is the beginning of a new business? We are undertaking. The business is to be a productive association. Constantine hardly listened. He kept glancing at his brother's sickly, consumptive face and felt more and more sorry for him. Or could he force himself to pay attention to what Nikolai was telling him about the association? He realized that this association was merely an anchor to save his brother from self-contempt. Nikolai Yevdin continued speaking. You know that capitalism oppresses the workers. Our workmen, the peasants, bear the whole burden of labor, but are so placed that work as they may, they cannot escape from their degrading condition. All the profits on their labor, by which they might better their condition, give themselves some leisure, and consequently gain some education, all this surplus value is taken away by the capitalists. And our society has so shaped itself that the more the people work, the richer the merchants and landowners will become, while the people will remain beasts of burden forever. And this system must be changed, he concluded with an inquiring look at his brother. Yes, of course, said Constantine, looking intently at the hectic flush which had appeared on his brother's face below its prominent cheekbones. And so we're starting a locksmith association in which all the products and the profits, and above all the instruments of production, will be common property. Where will the business be? Asked Constantine. In the village of Vatsrima Katsin government. Why in a village? It seems to me there is plenty of work to do in the country, as it is why start a locksmiths association there, because the peasants are still just as much slaves as they used to be, and that is why you and Sergei Ivanich don't like it when anyone wishes to deliver them from their slavery, replied Nikolai Yevdin, irritated by Constantine's objection. Constantine sighed and at the same time looked round the room, which was dismal and dirty. The sight seemed to irritate Nikolai still more. I know your aristocratic outlook, and Sergei Ivanich, I know that he uses all the powers of his mind to justify the existing evils. But why talk about Sergei Ivanich, said Levin with a smile. Sergei Ivanich, this is why, suddenly shouted Nikolai at the mention of the name. This is why. But what is the good of talking one thing only? Why have you come here? You despise it. Well, that is all right, then go away. Go, go, in God's name, he exclaimed, rising from his chair. Go, go. I do not despise it at all, Konstantin replied meekly. I do not even dispute it. Meanwhile, Maria Nikolaevna had come back. Nikolai gave her an angry look. She hurried up to him and said something in a whisper. I am not well and have grown irritable, said Nikolai, breathing heavily and quieting down. And you talk to me about Sergei Varnish and his article. It is such rubbish, such humbug, such self-deception. What can a man write about justice who does not understand it? Have you read his article? He said, turning to Kretsky again, sitting down to the table and clearing away from it a heap of half-filled cigarettes to make room. I have not read it, said Kretsky morosely, evidently not wishing to join in the conversation. Why not? Irritably answered Nikolai, still addressing Kretsky. Because I consider it unnecessary to waste time on it. What do you mean, may I ask? How you knew it would waste your time? That article is incomprehensible to many. I mean, it is above them. But it is a different matter with me. I see through his thought, and therefore know why it is weak. Everyone remained silent. Kretsky rose and took up his hat. Don't you want any supper? Well, come tomorrow and bring the locksmith. As soon as Kretsky had gone out, Nikolai smiled and winked. He also is not much good, he remarked. I can see. But at that moment Kretsky called him from outside the door. What do you want now? Said Nikolai, and went out into the passage. Left alone with Maria Nikolaevna, Levin spoke to her. Have you been long with my brother? He asked. Yes, it is the second year. Now his health is very bad. He drinks too much, she said. Really? What does he drink? He drinks vodka, and it's bad for him. Much vodka, whispered Levin. Yes, she said, looking timidly toward the door. Just as Nikolai returned. What are we talking about? He asked, frowning and looking from one to the other with frightened eyes. What was it? Nothing, replied Levin in confusion. If you do not wish to tell me, do as you please. Only you have no business to talk to her. She's a street girl, and you are a gentleman, he muttered, jerking his neck. You see, I have examined and weighed everything here, and regard my errors with compassion. He continued, again raising his voice. Nikolai Dmitri, whispered Maria Nikolaevna, again approaching him. Well, all right. And how about supper? I hear it is, he said, noticing a waiter who was bringing in a tray. Here, put it down here, he said crossly, and at once poured out a wine glass full of vodka and drank it greedily. I'll drink, will you? He said to his brother, brightening up at once. Well, we've had enough of Sergei Ivanitch. I'm glad to see you anyhow, whatever one may say. After all, we are not strangers. Come, have a drink. Don't know what you're doing, he continued, greedily chewing a crust of bread and filling himself another glass. Are you getting on? I'm living alone in the country as I did before, and I look after the farming, answered Konstantin, observing with horror how greedily his brother ate and drank, and trying not to let it be seen that he noticed it. Why don't you get married? I had not the chance, replied Konstantin, blushing. Why not? For me, all that is over. I have spoiled my life. I have said and still say that if I had been given my share of the property when I wanted it, everything would have been different. Konstantin hastened to change the subject. Do you know that your Vanyusha is now a clerk in my office at Pokrovsk? He said. Nikolai jerked his head and grew thoughtful. Yes, tell me what is happening in Pokrovsk. Is the house still standing, and the birch trees, and our schoolroom? And is Felipe the gardener really still living? How well I remember the garden house and the sofa. Mine don't change anything in the house, but get married soon and set things going again as they used to be. Then I will come to you. If you have a good wife, come to me at once, said Levin. How well we might settle down there. I would come if I were sure I should not find Sergei Varnish there. You won't find him there. I live quite apart from him. Still, say what you will. You must choose between him and me, said Nikolai with a timid look at his brother. His timidity touched Konstantin. If you want my full confession about it, I will tell you that I take no side in your quarrel with Sergei Ivanitch. You are both to blame, you more in external matters, and he more in essential ones. Ah, Ethan, you have grasped it, joyfully exclaimed Nikolai. But personally, if you care to know it, I value your friendship more. Because why? Konstantin could not tell him that it was because Nikolai was unfortunate and needed friendship, but Nikolai understood that he meant just that, and frowning again took hold of the vodka bottle. Enough, Nikolai Demetrius, said Maria Nikolaevna, stretching out her plump arm with its bare wrist to take the bottle. There, go, leave me alone, I'll thrash you, shouted he. Maria Nikolaevna gave a mild, kindly smile, which evoked one from Nikolai, and she took away the bottle. Do you think she doesn't understand, said Nikolai, she understands it all better than any of us. There really is something good and sweet about her. You were never in Moscow before, Konstantin asked very politely. Just in order to say something, don't speak to her in that way, it frightens her. No one but the magistrate, when she was tried for an attempt to escape from the house of ill fame, ever spoke to her so politely. Oh heavens, how senseless everything is in this world, he suddenly exclaimed. All these new institutions, these magistrates, these zemstvos, what a confusion it all is. And he began to relate all his encounters with these new institutions. Konstantin Levin listened to him, and the condemnation of the social institutions, which he shared with him and had often expressed, was unpleasant to him when he heard it from his brother's lips. We shall understand it better in the next world, he said playfully. In the next world? Oh, I do dislike that next world, said Nikolai, fixing his wild, frightened eyes on his brother's face. One would think that to leave all these abominations, these muddles of one's own and other people's, would be good, yet I fear death, I fear it terribly, he shuddered. Or do drink something, would you like some champagne, or let us go out somewhere else? Let us go to the gypsies. Do you know, I've become fond of the gypsies and the Russian folk songs. His speech began to grow confused, and he jumped from one subject to another. With Marcia's help, Konstantin succeeded in persuading him not to go out anywhere, and got him into bed quite tipsy. Marcia promised to write to Konstantin in case of need, and to try to persuade Nikolai to go and live with him. Chapter 26. Next morning, Konstantin Levin left Moscow, and toward evening he reached home. On his way back in the train, he talked with his fellow passengers about politics and the new railways, and felt oppressed, just as in Moscow, by the confusion of the views expressed by discontent with himself and a vague sense of shame. But when he got out of the train at his station, and by the dim light from the station windows saw his one-eyed coachman Ignat with his coat collar turned up, and his sledge with its carpet-lined back, his horses with their tied-up tails, and a harness with its rings and tassels, and when Ignat, while still putting the luggage into the sledge, began telling him the village news, how the contractor had come and Parva had carved live, and felt that the confusion was beginning to clear away, and his shame and self-dissatisfaction to pass, he felt this at the mere sight of Ignat and the horses. But when he had put on the sheepskin coat that had been brought for him and well wrapped up, had seated himself in the sledge and started homeward, turning over in his mind the orders he would give about the work on the estate. And as he watched the side horse, once a saddle horse, that had been overridden, a spirited animal from the dawn, he saw what had befallen him in quite a different light. He felt that he was himself, and did not wish to be anyone else. He only wished now to be better than he had been formerly. First of all, he decided that he would no longer hope for the exceptional happiness which marriage was to have given him, and consequently he would not underrate the present as he had done. Secondly, he would never again allow himself to be carried away by passion, the repulsive memory of which had so tormented him when he was making up his mind to propose. Then, remembering his brother Nikolai, he determined that he would never allow himself to forget him again, but would watch over him, keep him in sight, and be ready to help when things went hard with him. And he felt that that would be soon. Then his brother's talk about communism, which he had taken lightly at the time, now made him think he considered an entire change of economic conditions nonsense. But he'd always felt the injustice of his superfluities compared with the peasant's poverty, and now decided, in order to feel himself quite justified, that though he had always worked hard and lived simply, he would in future work still more and allow himself still less luxury. And it all seemed to him so easy to carry out that he was in a pleasant reverie the whole way home, and it was with cheerful hopes for a new and better life that he reached his house. Toward 9 o'clock in the evening, a light fell on the snow-covered space in front of the house from the windows of the room of his old nurse Agatha Mikhailovna, who now acted as his housekeeper. She had not yet gone to bed, and Kutzman, whom she had roused, came running out barefoot and still half asleep into the porch. Lasker, a setter bitch, ran out to almost throwing Kutzma off his feet, and whined and rubbed herself against Levin's knees, jumping up and wishing but not daring to put her front paws on his chest. "You have soon come back, sir," said Agatha Mikhailovna. "I was homesick." Agatha Mikhailovna, "Visiting is all very well, but there is no place like home," he replied, and went into his study. A candle just brought and gradually lit up the study, and its familiar details became visible: the stag's horns, the bookshelves, the looking glass, the hot air aperture of the stove with its brass lid which had long been in need of repair, his father's couch, the large table on which were an open volume, a broken ashtray, and an exercise book in his handwriting. When he saw all this, he was overcome by a momentary doubt of the possibility of starting the new life of which he had been dreaming on his way. All these traces of his old life seemed to seize hold of him and say, "No, you will not escape us, and will not be different, but will remain such as you have been, full of doubts, full of dissatisfaction with yourself, and of vain attempts at improvement, followed by failures and continual hopes of the happiness which has escaped you and is impossible for you." That was what the thing said. But another voice within his soul was saying that one must not submit to the past, and that one can do anything with oneself. And obeying the latter voice, he went to the corner where the 36-pound dumbbells lay, and began doing gymnastic exercises with them to invigorate himself. He heard a creaking of steps at the door and hurriedly put down the dumbbells. His steward entered and said that the Lord be thanked, everything was all right, but that the buckwheat had burnt in the new drying kiln. This news irritated Liven. The new kiln had been built and partly invented by him. The steward had always been against the new kiln, and now proclaimed with suppressed triumph that the buckwheat had got burned. Liven felt quite certain that if it had been burnt, it was only because the precautions about which he had given instructions over and over again had been neglected. He was vexed, and he reprimanded the steward. But the steward had one important and pleasant event to report. Parva, his best and most valuable cow, bought at the cattle show, had carved. "Kutsma, bring me my sheepskin, and you tell them to bring a lantern. I will go and have a look at her," he said to the steward. The sheds where the most valuable cattle were kept were just behind the house. Crossing the yard past the heap of snow by the lilac bush, he reached the shed. There was a warm, steaming smell of manure when the frozen door opened, and the cows, astonished at the unaccustomed light of the lantern, began moving on their clean straw. Liven saw the broad, smooth, black mottled back of a Dutch cow. The bull Burkett, with a ring through his nose, was lying down and almost rose up, but changed his mind and only snorted a couple of times as they passed by the red beauty. Parva, enormous as a hippopotamus, turned her back, hiding her calf from the newcomers and sniffing at it. Liven entered the stall and examined Parva, who, becoming excited, was about to low, but quieted down when Liven moved the calf toward her and, sighing heavily, began licking it with her rough tongue. The calf fumbled about, pushing its nose under its mother's belly and swinging its little tail. "Show a light here, Theodore, here," said Levin, examining the calf. "Like its mother," he said, "although the color is its father's. Very fine, big-boned and deep-flanked. Vasily Fedorovitch, isn't she fine?" he said, turning to the steward and quite forgiving him for the buckwheat. Under the influence of his satisfaction about the calf, whom could she take after not to be good? "Simeon, the contractor, came the day after you left. We shall have to employ him." "Constantine Demetrius," said the steward, "I told you about the machine. This one question." Liven back to all the details of his farming, which was on a large and elaborate scale. He went straight from the cowshed to the office, and after talking things over with the steward and with Simeon the contractor, he returned to the house and went directly upstairs to the drawing room. Chapter 27. It was a large, old-fashioned house, and though only Liven was living in it, he used and heated the whole of it. He knew this to be foolish and even wrong and contrary to his new plans, but this house was a whole world to Devane. It was the world in which his father and mother had lived and died. They had lived a life which appeared to him ideally perfect, and which he had dreamt of renewing with a wife and family of his own. Liven could scarcely remember his mother. His conception of her was to him a sacred memory, and in his imagination his future wife was to be a repetition of the enchanting and holy ideal of womanhood that his mother had been. He could not imagine the love of woman without marriage, and even pictured to himself a family first, and then the woman who would give him the family. His views on marriage, therefore, did not resemble those of most of his acquaintances, for whom marriage was only one of many social affairs. For Levin, it was the chief thing in life on which the whole happiness of life depended, and now he had to renounce it. When he had settled in the armchair in the little drawing room, where he always had his tea, and Agatha Mikhailovna had brought it in for him, and had sat down at the window with her usual Remark, I will sit down, sir. He felt that strange to say he had not really forgotten his dreams, and that he could not live without them. With her or with another they would come true. He read his book and followed what he read, stopping now and then to listen to Agatha Mikhailovna, who chattered indefatigably, and at the same time various pictures of farming and future family life arose disconnectedly in his mind. He felt that in the depth of his soul something was settling down, adjusting, and composing itself. He listened to Agatha Mikhailovna's talk of how Prokhor had forgotten the Lord was spending on drink the money Levin had given him to buy a horse with, and had beaten his wife nearly to death. He listened and read and remembered the whole sequence of thoughts raised by what he was reading. It was a book of Tyndall's on heat. He recalled his disapproval of Tyndall's self-conceit concerning the cleverness of his experiments and his lack of a philosophical outlook, and suddenly the joyous thought came uppermost. In 2 years' time, I shall have to Dutch cows in my herd, and Parva herself may still be alive. There will be 12 cows by Burkett, and these 3 to crown all splendid. He returned to his book. Well, let us grant that electricity and heat are one and the same. But can we substitute the one quantity for the other in solving an equation? No. Then what of it? The connection between all the forces of nature can be felt instinctively without all that it will be especially good when Parva's calf is already a red-mottled cow, and the whole herd, in which these 3 will be splendid. To go out with my wife and the visitors and meet the herd. My wife will say, "We, Constantine, and I reared this calf like a baby. How can you be interested in these things?" The visitor will ask. "All that interests him interests me. But who is she?" And he remembered what had happened in Moscow. Well, what is to be done? It is not my fault, but now everything will be on new lines. It is nonsense to say that life will prevent it, that the past prevents it. I must struggle to live a better, far better life. He lifted his head and pondered old Laska, who had not yet quite digested her joy at her master's return, and had run out to bark in the yard, now came back bringing a smell of fresh air with her into the room, and wagging her tail she approached him, and putting her head under his hand whined plaintively, asking to be patted. She all but speaks, said Agatha Mikhailovna. She's only a dog, but she understands that her master has come back feeling depressed. Why depressed? Oh, don't I see? I ought to understand gentlefolk by this time. I've grown up among them from a child. Never mind, my dear, as long as you have good health and a clean conscience. Levin looked at her intently, surprised that she knew so well what was in his mind. Shall I bring you a little more tea? She said, and went out with his cup. Lasker kept on pushing her head under his hand. He patted her a little, and she curled herself up at his feet with her head on her outstretched hind paw, and to show that all was now well and satisfactory, she slightly opened her mouth, smacked her sticky lips, and drawing them more closely over her old teeth, lay still in blissful peace. Levin attentively watched this last movement of hers. "And it is just the same with me," he said to himself. "It is just the same with me. What does it matter? All is well." Chapter 28. Early in the morning, after the ball, Anna sent a telegram to her husband to say that she was leaving Moscow that same evening. "Really, I must go," she said, explaining her altered plans to her sister-in-law in a tone suggesting that she had suddenly remembered so many things she had to do that it was not even possible to enumerate them all. "Really, I'd better go today." Stefanov Blonsky was not dining at home, but promised to be back at 7 to see his sister off. Kitty also had not come, but had sent a note to say that she had a headache. Dolly and Anna dined alone with the children and their English governess. Whether it is that children are inconstant, or that they are sensitive, and felt that Anna was not the same person today as she had been that other day when they had been so fond of her, and that she no longer took any interest in them. At any rate, they suddenly left off playing with their aunt and loving her, and were not at all concerned about her leaving. Anna spent the whole morning preparing for her departure, writing notes to her Moscow acquaintances, making up accounts, and packing. It seemed to Dolly that Anna was not at ease in her mind, but in a state of anxiety that Dolly knew well from her own experience, a state which does not come on without a cause, but generally hides dissatisfaction with oneself. After dinner, Anna went to her room to dress, and Dolly followed her. "How strange you are today," said Dolly. "Do you think so?" "I'm not strange, but wicked. It sometimes happens to me. I feel ready to cry. It is very silly, but it will pass," said Anna hurriedly, and she bent her flushed face over the tiny bag into which she was packing a nightcap and some lawn handkerchiefs. Her eyes shone peculiarly and kept filling with tears. I did not want to leave Petersburg, and now I do not want to leave here. You came here and did a good action, said Dolly, scrutinizing her attentively. Anna looked at her with her eyes wet with tears. Do not say that, Dolly. I have done and could do nothing. I often wonder why people conspire to spoil me. What have I done, and what could I do? There was enough love in your heart to forgive, but for you, God only knows what would have happened. How lucky you are, Anna, said Dolly. Everything in your soul is clear and good. Everyone has a skeleton in their cupboard, as the English say. Oh, what skeleton have you? Everything about you is so clear. I have one, said Anna, and unexpectedly following her tears, a sly, humorous smile puckered her lips. Well, at least your skeleton is a funny one and not a dismal one, said Dolly, smiling. No, it is a dismal one. Do you know why I'm going today and not tomorrow? This is a confession of something that oppresses me, and I want to make it to you, said Anna, determinedly throwing herself back in an armchair and looking straight into Dolly's eyes. And to her surprise, Dolly saw that Anna was blushing to her ears and to the curly black locks on her neck. Do you know, continued Anna, why Kitty did not come to dinner? She is jealous of me. I have spoiled. I mean, I was the cause of the ball being a torture instead of a pleasure to her. But really, I was not to blame, or only a very little, she said, drawling out the word very in a high-pitched voice. Oh, how like Stever you said that, remarked Dolly, laughing. Anna was annoyed. Oh, no, I am not Stever, she said, frowning. The reason I have told you is that I do not even for a moment allow myself to distrust myself. But at the moment when she uttered these words, she knew they were untrue. She not only distrusted herself, but was agitated by the thought of Vronsky, and was leaving sooner than she had intended, only that she might not meet him again. Yes, Steva told me that you danced the mazurka with him, and that you cannot think how queerly it came about. I only thought of arranging the match, and suddenly it all came out quite differently, perhaps against my own will. She blushed and stopped. Oh, they feel that at once, said Dolly, but I should be in despair if there were anything serious in it on his side. Anna interrupted her. I am sure that it will all be forgotten, and Kitty will no longer hate me. Well, do you know, Anna, to tell you the truth, I'm not very anxious that Kitty should marry him. It is much better that it should come to nothing. If Bronsky is capable of falling in love with you in a day, oh my goodness, how stupid it would be, said Anna, and again a deep flush of pleasure suffused her face at hearing the thought that occupied her mind expressed in words. So I'm going away, having made an enemy of Kitty, of whom I'm so fond. Oh, what a darling she is. But you will put it right, eh, Dolly? Dolly could hardly repress a smile. She was fond of Anna, but it was pleasant to find that she had a weakness, an enemy. Oh, that is impossible. I should so like you all to love me as I love you, and now I love you still more, said Anna, with tears in her eyes. Oh dear, how silly I am today. She dabbed her face with her handkerchief and began to dress Oblonsky, smelling of wine and cigars, with his face red and happy, came in late. Just as she was about to start, Anna's emotion had spread to Dolly, who, as she embraced her sister-in-law for the last time, whispered, remember that I love and always shall love you as my best friend. I do not know why you should, said Anna, kissing her and trying to hide her tears. You understood and understand me. Goodbye, my sweet one. Chapter 29. Well, that's all over, thank heaven, was Anna's first thought when she had taken leave of her brother, who stood to the last moment obstructing the entrance to the railway carriage. She sat down beside her maid Anishka and peered round the dimly lit sleeping compartment. Thank heaven, tomorrow I shall see Saritsa and Alexei Alexandrovich again, and my good accustomed life will go on as of old with the same preoccupied mind. She had had all that day. Anna prepared with pleasure and great deliberation for the journey. With her deft little hands, she unlocked her red bag, took out a small pillow, which she placed on her knees, and locked the bag again. Then she carefully wrapped up her feet and sat down comfortably. An invalid lady was already going to bed. Two other ladies began talking to Anna. One, a fat old woman, while wrapping up her feet, remarked upon the heating of the carriage. Anna said a few words in answer, but not foreseeing anything interesting from the conversation, asked her maid to get out her reading lamp, fixed it to the arm of her seat, and took a paper knife and an English novel from her handbag. At first she could not read for a while. The bustle of people moving about disturbed her, and when the train had finally started, it was impossible not to listen to the noises. Then there was the snow beating against the window on her left, to which it stuck, and the sight of the guard who passed through the carriage closely wrapped up and covered with snow on one side. Also the conversation about the awful snowstorm which was raging outside distracted her attention, and so it went on, and on the same jolting and knocking, the same beating of the snow on the window pane, the same rapid changes from steaming heat to cold and back again to heat, the gleam of the same faces through the semi-darkness, and the same voices. But at last Anna began to read and to follow what she read. Anishka was already dozing, her broad hands with a hole in one of the gloves holding the red bag on her lap. Anna read and understood, but it was unpleasant to read, that is to say, to follow the reflection of other people's lives. She was too eager to live herself. When she read how the heroine of the novel nursed a sick man, she wanted to move about the sick room with noiseless footsteps. When she read of a member of Parliament making a speech, she wished to make that speech. When she read how Lady Mary Rode to Hounds teased her sister-in-law and astonished everybody by her boldness, she wanted to do it herself. But there was nothing to be done, so she forced herself to read while her little hand toiled with the smooth paper knife. The hero of the novel had nearly attained to his English happiness of a baronetcy and an estate, and Anna wanted to go to the estate with him, when she suddenly felt that he must have been ashamed, and that she was ashamed of the same thing. But what was he ashamed of? What am I ashamed of? She asked herself with indignant surprise. She put down her book, leant back, and clasped the paper knife tightly in both hands. There was nothing to be ashamed of. She called up all her Moscow memories. They were all good and pleasant. She recalled the ball and Vronsky and his humble, enamored gaze, and their relations with one another. There was nothing to be ashamed of, and yet at that very point of her recollections, when she remembered Vronsky, the feeling of shame grew stronger, and some inner voice seemed to say to her, warm, very warm, burning, well, what of it? She finally said to herself with decision, changing her position on the seat, what does it signify? Am I afraid to look straight at it? What of it? Just as if there existed, or could exist, between me and this officer lad any relations differing from those with other acquaintances? She smiled disdainfully and again took up her book, but now she absolutely could not understand what she was reading. She passed her paper knife over the window pane, then pressed its cold, smooth surface against her cheek and almost laughed aloud. Suddenly overcome with unreasoning joy, she felt that her nerves were being stretched like strings drawn tighter and tighter round pegs. She felt her eyes opening wider, her fingers and toes nervously moving, and something inside her stopping her breath, and all the forms and sounds in the swaying semi-darkness around struck her with unusual vividness. Momentary doubts kept occurring in her mind as to whether the train was moving forwards or backwards or standing still. Was it Anishka who was sitting beside her, or a stranger? And am I here myself? Am I myself or another? She was afraid of giving way to these delirious thoughts. Something seemed to draw her to them, but she had the power to give way to them or to resist. To get over it, she rose, threw off her wrap, and took off the cape of her coat. She came to her senses for a moment and knew that the lean peasant in the long nankeen coat with a button missing, who had come into the compartment, was the carriage stoker and was looking at the thermometer, and that the wind and snow rushed in when he opened the door. But afterwards everything again became confused. The peasant in the long coat started gnawing at something on the wall. The old woman began stretching her legs the whole length of the carriage, which she filled with a black cloud. Then something squeaked and clattered in a dreadful manner, as if someone was being torn to pieces. Then a blinding red light appeared, and at last everything was hidden by a wall. Anna felt as if she had fallen through the floor. But all this did not seem dreadful, but amusing. The voice of a man wrapped up and covered with snow shouted something just above her ear. She rose and came to herself, understanding that they had stopped at a station, and that this was the guard. She asked Anishka to give her the cape she had removed and a shawl, and putting them on she moved to the door. Are you going out? asked Anishka. Yes, I want a breath of air. It's so hot in here. She opened the carriage door. The snow and wind rushed toward her and had a tussle with her for the door, and this struck her as amusing. She went out. The wind seemed only to have waited for her. It whistled merrily and tried to seize and carry her off, but she held on to the cold doorpost and held down her shawl. Then stepping onto the platform, she moved away from the carriage. The wind blew boisterously into the little porch of the carriage, but on the platform sheltered by the train, it was quiet. With enjoyment, she drew in full breaths of the snowy, frosty air as she stood beside her carriage, looking round at the platform and the lighted station. Chapter 30. A blustering storm was rushing and whistling between the wheels of the train and round the pillars and the corners of the station. The railway carriages, the pillars, the people, and everything that could be seen were covered on one side with snow, and that covering became thicker and thicker. A momentary lull would be followed by such a terrific gust that it seemed hardly possible to stand against it, yet people, merrily exchanging remarks, ran over the creaking boards of the platform, and the big station doors were constantly being opened and shut. The shadow of a man stooping slipped past her feet, and she heard a hammer striking the carriage wheels. "Let me have the telegram," came an angry voice from the other side out of the stormy darkness. "Here, please." "No." 28, cried other voices, while many people, muffled up and covered with snow, ran hither and thither. Two gentlemen passed her with glowing cigarettes between their lips. She took another deep breath to get her fill of fresh air, and had already drawn her hand out of her muff to take hold of the handrail and get into the train, when another man wearing a military overcoat came close between her and the wavering light of the lamp. She turned round and instantly recognized Vronsky. With his hand in salute, he bowed and asked if she wanted anything and whether he could be of any service to her. For some time she looked into his face without answering, and though he stood in the shade, she noticed, or thought she noticed, the expression of his face and eyes. It was the same expression of respectful ecstasy that had so affected her the night before. She had assured herself more than once during those last few days, and again a moment ago, that Vronsky in relation to her was only one of the hundreds of everlastingly identical young men she met everywhere, and that she would never allow herself to give him a thought. Yet now, at the first moment of seeing him again, she was seized by a feeling of joyful pride. There was no need for her to ask him why he was there. She knew as well as if he had told her that he was there in order to be where she was. "I did not know that you were going to." "Why are you going?" she asked, dropping the hand with which she was about to take hold of the handrail. Her face beamed with a joy and animation she could not repress. "Why am I going?" he repeated, looking straight into her eyes. "You know that I am going in order to be where you are," said he. "I cannot do otherwise." At that moment the wind, as if it had mastered all obstacles, scattered the snow from the carriage roofs and set a loose sheet of iron clattering, and in front the deep whistle of the engine howled mournfully and dismally. The awfulness of the storm appeared still more beautiful to her now. He had said just what her soul desired, but her reason dreaded. She did not reply, and he saw a struggle in her face. "Forgive me if my words displease you," he said humbly. He spoke courteously and respectfully, but so firmly and stubbornly that she was long unable to reply. "What you are saying is wrong, and if you are a good man, I beg you to forget it, as I will forget it," she said at last. "Not a word, not a movement of yours will I ever forget, nor can I." "Enough, enough," she cried, vainly trying to give a severe expression to her face, into which he was gazing eagerly. She took hold of the cold handrail, ascended the steps, and quickly entered the little lobby leading into the carriage. But in that little lobby she stopped, going over in her imagination what had just taken place. Though she could remember neither his nor her own words, she instinctively felt that that momentary conversation had drawn them terribly near to one another, and this both frightened her and made her happy. After standing still for a few seconds, she went into the carriage and sat down. The overwrought condition which tormented her before not only returned again, but grew worse, and reached such a degree that she feared every moment that something within her would give way under the intolerable strain. She did not sleep at all that night, but the strain and the visions which filled her imagination had nothing unpleasant or dismal about them. On the contrary, they seemed joyful, glowing, and stimulating. Toward morning, Anna, while still sitting up, fell into a doze. When she woke it was already light, and the train was approaching Petersburg. At once thoughts of home, her husband, her son, and the cares of the coming day and of those that would follow beset her. When the train stopped at the Petersburg terminus, and she got out, the first face she noticed was that of her husband. "Great heavens, what has happened to his ears?" she thought, gazing at his cold and commanding figure, and especially at the grisly ears which now so struck her pressing as they did against the rim of his hat. When he saw her, he came toward her with his customary ironical smile and looked straight at her with his large tired eyes. An unpleasant feeling weighed on her heart when she felt his fixed and weary gaze, as if she had expected to find him different. She was particularly struck by the feeling of dissatisfaction with herself which she experienced when she met him. It was that ordinary, well-known feeling, as if she were dissembling, which she experienced in regard to her husband, but formerly she had not noticed it, while now she was clearly and painfully conscious of it. Yes, as you see here is a devoted husband, devoted as in the first year of married life, consumed by desire. "To see you," said he in his slow, high-pitched voice and in the tone in which he always addressed her, a tone which ridiculed those who could use such words in earnest as Soretta. "Well," she asked, "and is this all the reward I get?" He said, "For my order he is quite well, quite well." Chapter 31. Vronsky did not even try to sleep that night. He sat in his place, his eyes staring straight before him, not observing the people who went in or out. And if previously his appearance of impenetrable calm had struck and annoyed those who did not know him, he now seemed to them even prouder and more self-confident. He looked at people as if they were inanimate things. A nervous young man, a law court official, who sat opposite, hated him for that look. The young man repeatedly lit his cigarette at Vronsky's talk to him and even jostled him to prove that he was not a thing but a man. The Vronsky still looked at him as at a street lamp, and the young man made grimaces, feeling that he was losing self-control. Under the stress of this refusal to regard him as human, Vronsky neither saw nor heard anyone. He felt himself a king, not because he believed that he had made an impression on Anna. He did not yet believe that, but because the impression she had made on him filled him with happiness and pride. What would come of it all he did not know and did not even consider. He felt that all his powers, hitherto dissipated and scattered, were now concentrated and directed with terrible energy toward one blissful aim. This made him happy. He knew only that he had told her the truth, that he would go where she went, that all the happiness of life and the only meaning of life for him now was in seeing and hearing her. When he had got out of the train at Bogota station to drink a glass of seltzer water and had seen Anna, he had involuntarily at once told her just what he was thinking about it. He was glad he had said it to her and that she now knew it and was thinking about it. He did not sleep at all that night. When he returned to the train, he kept recalling all the positions in which he had seen her and all her words, and in his imagination, causing his heart to stand still, floated pictures of a possible future. When he got out of the train at Petersburg, he felt, despite his sleepless night, as fresh and animated as after a cold bath. He stopped outside the carriage, waiting till she appeared. "I shall see her again," he thought, and smiled involuntarily. "I shall see her, walk her face. She will say something, turn her head, look at me, perhaps even smile." But before seeing her, he saw her husband, whom the station master was respectfully conducting through the crowd. "Dear me, a husband!" Only now did Vronsky for the first time clearly realize that the husband was connected with her. He knew she had a husband, but had not believed in his existence, and only fully believed in him when he saw him there, his head and shoulders, and the black trousers containing his legs, and especially when he saw that husband, with an air of ownership, quietly take her hand, when he saw Karenin, with his fresh Petersburg face, his sternly self-confident figure, his round hat, and his slightly rounded back. Vronsky believed in his existence and had such a disagreeable sensation as a man tortured by thirst might feel on reaching a spring and finding a dog, sheep, or pig in it, drinking the water and making it muddy. Karenin's gait, the swinging of his thighs, and his wide short feet particularly offended Vronsky, who acknowledged only his own unquestionable right to love Anna, but she was still the same, and the sight of her still affected him physically, exhilarating and stimulating him and filling him with joy. He ordered his German valet, who had run up from a second-class carriage, to get his luggage and take it home, and he himself went up to her. He saw the husband and wife meet, and with the penetration of a lover he noticed the signs of slight embarrassment when she spoke to her husband. "No, she doesn't and can't love him," he decided mentally. While he was approaching her from behind, he observed with joy that she became aware of his approach and was about to turn, but on recognizing him again addressed her husband. "Did you "Have a good night," he inquired, bowing toward them both and leaving it to Karenin to take the greeting as meant for himself and to recognize him or not as he pleased. "Yes, quite comfortable, thank you," she replied. Her face seemed tired and had none of that play which showed now in a smile and now in the animation of her eyes. But just for an instant, as she looked at him, he saw a gleam in her eyes, and though the spark was at once extinguished, that one instant made him happy. She glanced at her husband to see whether he knew Vronsky. Karenin looked at him with displeasure, absently trying to recall who he might be. Vronsky's calm self-confidence struck like a side on a stone against the cold self-confidence of Karenin. "Count Vronsky said. "Anna, I believe we have met before," said Karenin, extending his hand with indifference. "You traveled there with the mother and came back with the son," he said, uttering every word distinctly, as though it was something valuable he was giving away. "I suppose you are returning from Follow," he remarked, and without waiting for an answer, said to his wife in his playful manner, "Well, were many tears shed in Moscow over the parting?" By addressing himself thus to his wife, he conveyed to Vronsky his wish to be alone with her, and turning to Vronsky, he touched his hand. But Vronsky, addressing Anna, said, "I hope to have the honor of calling on you." Karenin glanced at him with his weary eyes. "I should be very pleased," he said coldly. "We are at home on Mondays." Then, having finally dismissed Vronsky, he said to his wife in his usual bantering tone, "What a good thing it was that I had just half an hour to spare to meet you, and was able to show my devotion. You insist too much on your devotion for me to value it greatly," she replied in the same playful tone, while she involuntarily listened to the sound of Vronsky's footsteps following them. "But what does he matter to me?" she asked herself, and began inquiring of her husband how Tsaritsa had got on during her absence. "Oh, splendidly. Mariette says he was very sweet, but I'm sorry to grieve you. He did not fret after you like your husband. But I must thank you once again, my dear, for having made me the present of a day. Our dear Samovar will be in ecstasies." He called the celebrated Countess Lydia Ivanovna Samovar because she was always getting heated and boiling over about something she was asking after you, "And you know, if I may advise, you should go and see her today. Her heart is always aching about somebody at present, in addition to all her other worries. She is concerned about the Oblonskys' reconciliation." Countess Lydia Ivanovna was Anna's husband's friend, and the center of that St. Petersburg society, with which Anna through her husband was most closely connected. "But I wrote to her, yes, but she wants the particulars. Go and see her, my dear, if you're not too tired. Kondraty is here with the carriage for you, and I must be off to the committee now. I shan't have to dine alone," he went on, no longer in a bantering manner. "You can't think how I used," and with a long pressure of her hand and a special kind of smile, he helped her into the carriage. Chapter 30. To the first person to meet Anna when she reached home was her son. He ran down the stairs to her regardless of his governess's cries, and with desperate delight called out, "Mama, Mama." When he reached her, he clung round her neck. "I told you it was Mama," he shouted to the governess. "I knew her son like his father." Produced on Anna a feeling akin to disappointment. Her fancy had pictured him nicer than he was in reality. She had to come down to reality in order to enjoy him as he was. But even as he was charming with his fair curls, blue eyes, and plump shapely legs in tight-fitting stockings. Anna experienced an almost physical pleasure in feeling his proximity and his caresses, and a moral solace when she met his simple, trustful, and loving gaze and heard his naive questions. She unpacked the presents which Dolly's children had sent him and told him that there was a girl in Moscow whose name was Tanya, who could read and even teach other children. "And am I worse than she?" asked Shretsa to me. "You are the best in the world, I know," he said, smiling before Anna had time to finish her coffee. The Countess Lydia Ivanovna was announced. The Countess was a tall, stout woman with a sickly, sallow complexion and beautiful, dreamy black eyes. Anna was fond of her, but today she seemed to see her for the first time, with all her defects. "Well, my dear, did you take the olive branch?" asked the Countess Lydia Ivanovna as soon as she entered the room. "Yes, it's all over, but the whole affair was not as serious as we thought," Anna replied. "My sister-in-law is in general too impulsive, but the Countess, who was interested in everything that did not concern her, had a habit of never listening to what interested her." And she interrupted Anna. "Ah, yes, there is much sorrow and evil in the world, and today I'm terribly worried." "Why, what is the matter?" asked Anna, trying to suppress a smile. "I am getting tired of breaking lances uselessly in the cause of truth, and sometimes I feel quite unstrung that little sister's affair, this was a philanthropic, religio-patrician society, was going splendidly. But to work with those gentlemen is impossible, continued the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, with an ironical air of resignation. To fate they took the idea and perverted it, and are now discussing it in such a trivial, petty way to or through your husband among them understand the full significance of the affair. But the others just dropped it yesterday. I had a letter from Pravdin. Pravdin was a well-known Panslavist who resided abroad. The Countess told Anna what he had written. She then went on to tell her of other unpleasantnesses and of the underhand opposition to the plan for uniting the churches, and she went away in a hurry, as she had that afternoon to be at a meeting of another society, as well as to attend a Slovakic committee meeting. This is all just as it was before. But how is it that I never noticed it before, said Anna to herself, or is it that she is specially irritated this morning? But it's really funny, her aim is to do good. She is a Christian, and yet she's always angry, and always has enemies, all on account of Christianity and philanthropy. After the Countess had left, a friend, a high official's wife, arrived and gave Anna all the Petersburg news. At 3 she also left, promising to come back to dinner. Karenin was at the ministry. Anna left alone, spent part of the time before dinner in seeing her son have his dinner. He dined apart in putting her things in order and in reading and answering the notes and letters that had accumulated on her table. The feeling of causeless shame she had felt during the journey and her agitation had quite vanished. In her accustomed conditions of life she again felt firm and blameless. She thought with wonder of her state. The day before, what had happened? Nothing. Vronsky said some silly things to which it will be easy to put a stop, and I said what was necessary. It is unnecessary and impossible to speak of it. To my husband, to speak of it would be to give it an importance that does not belong to it. She remembered how she had once told her husband about one of his subordinates who very nearly made her a declaration, and how Karenin had answered that every woman living in society was liable to such things, but that he had full confidence in her tact and would never degrade himself and her by being jealous. So there is no need to tell him. Besides, thank heaven, there is nothing to tell, she said to herself. Chapter 33. Karenin returned from the ministry at 4 o'clock. But as often happened, he had no time to go up and see his wife. He went straight to his study to receive some petitioners and sign a few documents brought by his private secretary. At the Karenins' dinners there were usually about 3 visitors. This time there came an old lady, a cousin of Karenin's, the director of a department, the director's wife, and a young man who had been recommended to Karenin for a post under him. Anna went into the drawing room to entertain them exactly at 5. The bronze clock style of Peter I had not finished striking. Karenin entered in evening dress with a white tie and to stars on his coat, as he had to attend an official meeting directly after dinner. Every moment of his life was filled up and apportioned, and in order to find time to perform all the tasks allotted to each day, he observed the strictest regularity. Without haste and without rest was his motto. He entered the room, greeted everybody, and quickly sat down smiling at his wife. So my solitude has come to an end. You wouldn't believe how uncomfortable. He put special emphasis on the word uncomfortable. It is to dine alone at dinner. He spoke a little about Moscow affairs, with his wife asking with an ironical smile after Stepan Oblonsky, but for the most part the conversation was general and dealt with Petersburg service and social affairs. After dinner he spent half an hour with his guests, and then, having again with a smile pressed his wife's hand, went away. To the council that evening Anna went neither to see the princess bedsheets, Vespasia, who having heard of Anna's return had invited her, nor to the theater, where she had a box for that evening. Her chief reason for not going was that a dress on which she had counted was not ready altogether. When after her visitors had left, Anna busied herself with her toilet. She was much vexed before going to Moscow. She, being an adept at dressing on comparatively little money, left 3 dresses to be altered. She wanted them made up so that they should be unrecognizable, and they were to have been sent home 3 days ago. But she now found that 2 were not ready at all, while the 3rd had not been done in the way she wished. The dressmaker came to explain that it was better as she had done it, and Anna lost her temper to such a degree that she afterwards felt ashamed completely. To regain her composure, she went to the nursery and spent the evening with her son. She put him to bed herself, made the sign of the cross over him, and tucked him up. She was glad She had not gone out that evening, but had spent it so pleasantly at home she felt light-hearted and tranquil, and saw clearly that what in the train had appeared so important had merely been an ordinary and trivial incident of society life, and that there was no reason for her to feel ashamed or for anyone to blame her. She sat down by the fire with an English novel and awaited her husband. Exactly at 9:30, there was a ring at the front door, and he entered the room. "Here you are at last," she said, holding out her hand to him. He kissed it and seated himself beside her. "In general, I see that your journey has been a success," said he. "Yes, quite," she replied, and related everything that had happened from the beginning: her journey with the Countess von Schaumburg, her arrival, the accident at the railway station. Then she spoke of her pity, first for her brother and then for Dolly. "I don't think that one can excuse such a man, even though he is your brother," remarked Karenin severely. Anna smiled. She knew he had said that in order to show that no consideration of kinship could hinder the expression of his sincere opinion. She knew that Trey and her husband's character knew and liked it. "I am glad it has all ended satisfactorily, and that you are back again," he continued. "But what are they saying there about the new statute I carried in the council?" Anna had heard nothing about the statute and felt ashamed that she had so lightly forgotten what was of such importance to him. "Here, on the contrary, it has made quite a stir," he said with a self-satisfied smile. Anna saw that he wanted to tell her something pleasant to himself about that affair, and by questioning she led him on to tell her all about it with the same self-satisfied smile. He told her about the ovations he had received on account of the enactment of that statute. "I was very pleased. It shows that at last a clear and reasonable view of the matter is beginning to be firmly held among us." Having finished his second cup of tea and cream and his bread and butter, he rose and went into his study. "And have you not been out anywhere? You must have been dull," he said. "Oh no," she answered, rising and following him through the room to his study. "And what are you reading now?" she asked. "I am now reading the Duc de Lyon's Politique de l'Affaire," he replied. "A very remarkable book." Anna smiled, as one smiles at the weaknesses of people one loves, and slipping her hand under his arm walked with him to the study door. She knew his habit, which should become a necessity, of reading in the evening. She knew that in spite of his time being almost entirely absorbed by the duties of his post, he considered it incumbent on him to follow everything of importance that appeared in the world of thought. She also knew that really he was interested in political, philosophical, and theological books, and that art was quite foreign to his nature. Yet in spite of this, or rather because of it, he never ignored anything that caused a stir in that sphere, but considered it his duty to read everything. She knew that in the sphere of politics, philosophy, and theology, Alexei Alexandrovich doubted and searched, but in questions of art, poetry, and especially music, which he did not at all understand, he held most definite and firm opinions. He liked talking of Shakespeare, Raphael, and Beethoven, and about the importance of the new schools of poetry and music, which in his mind were all classified with very logical exactitude. "Well, God bless you," she said at the door of the study, where a shaded candle and a bottle of water had been placed ready for him beside his armchair. "And I will go and write to them in Moscow." He pressed her hand and again kissed it. "After all, he is a good man, truthful, kind, and remarkable in his own sphere," said Anna to herself when she'd returned to her room, as if defending him from someone who accused him and declared it was impossible to love him. "But why do his ears stick out so? Or has he had his hair cut?" Exactly at midnight, when Anna was still sitting at her writing table finishing a letter to Dolly, she heard the measured tread of slippered feet, and Karenin entered, freshly washed, his hair brushed, and a book under his arm. It's time," said he with a peculiar smile, going into their bedroom. And what right had he to look at him as he did, thought Anna, remembering how Vronsky had looked at Karenin when she was undressed. She went into the bedroom, but on her face not only was there not a trace of that animation which during her stay in Moscow had sparkled in her eyes and smile, but on the contrary, the fire in her now seemed quenched or hidden somewhere very far away. Chapter 34. When he went to Moscow, Vronsky had left his large flat on the Moscow to his friend and favorite comrade Petritsky. Petritsky was a young lieutenant, not of very aristocratic birth, and not only not wealthy, but heavily in debt, tipsy every evening, and often under arrest for amusing or improper escapades. but popular both with his comrades and superiors arriving home from the station. About noon, Vronsky recognized a hired broom at the front door when he rang the bell. While still outside, he heard men's laughter, a woman's lisping voice, and Paderewski shouting, "If it is one of the villains, don't let him in." Vronsky told the servants not to announce his arrival and softly entered the first room. Paderewski's friend, the Baroness Chilton, her lilac satin dress and pink and white face glistening, and like a canary filling the whole room with her Parisian voice, was seated at the round table, making coffee. Paderewski in his greatcoat, and Captain Kamerovsky in full uniform, probably straight from parade, sat on each side of her. "Vronsky, bravo!" exclaimed Paderewski, jumping up and noisily pushing back his chair. "The master himself." "Baroness, some coffee for him out of the new coffee pot." "Well, this is unexpected. I hope you are pleased with this ornament to your study," he added, pointing to the Baroness. "Of course you know one another." "I should think so," replied Vronsky with a merry smile as he pressed the Baroness's small hand. "Of course, quite old friends. You have returned from a journey," said the Baroness. "Oh, I'll be off home this very moment if I am in the way you are at home." "Where you are?" Baroness said. "Vronsky. How do you do, Kamerovsky?" he added, coldly shaking hands with the captain. "There now, you never managed to say such pretty things," said the Baroness to Paderewski. "Oh yes, why not? After dinner I'll say things quite as good as that. But after dinner there's no merit in it." "Well then, I'll give you some coffee, but have a wash and smarten yourself up," said the Baroness, again sitting down and carefully turning a small screw of the coffee pot. "Pierre, pass me the coffee," she said to Paderewski, whom, not concealing their relations, she called Pierre, the French for Peter, because of his surname. "I'll put a little more into the pot. You'll spoil it." "No, I shan't." "And your wife," the Baroness said, suddenly interrupting Vronsky's conversation with his comrade, "we here have been marrying you off. Have you brought your wife?" "No, Baroness, a Bohemian I was born, and a Bohemian I shall die. So much the better, so much the better. Give me your hand." And the Baroness, instead of releasing Vronsky, began telling him her plans for the future, interspersing jokes and asking his advice. "He won't agree to a divorce. Whatever am I to do? He was her husband. I want to begin an action. What would you advise, Kamerovsky?" "Mind the coffee, it's boiling over. Don't you see I'm occupied? I want to bring an action because I need my property. You see how absurd it is that? Because I am supposed to be unfaithful," she said contemptuously. "He wishes to have the use of my property." Vronsky listened with pleasure to the merry prattle of the pretty young woman, agreed with what she said, and half in fun gave her advice. In a word, he immediately took up his habitual manner with women of her kind. In his Petersburg world, people were divided into two quite opposite sorts. One, the inferior sort, the paltry, stupid, and above all, ridiculous people who believe that a husband should live with the one wife to whom he is married, that a maiden should be pure, a woman modest, and a man manly, self-controlled, and firm. One should bring up one's children to earn their living, should pay one's debts, and other nonsense of that kind. These were the old-fashioned and ridiculous people. But there was another sort of people, the real people, to which all his set belonged, who had above all to be well-bred, generous, bold, gay, and to abandon themselves unblushingly to all their passions and laugh at everything else. Just for a moment Vronsky was staggered, having brought back from Moscow the impression of a totally different world. But immediately, as though he had put his foot into an old slipper, he re-entered his former gay and pleasant world. The coffee never got made, but boiled over and splashed everybody, effecting just what was required. That is, it gave an excuse for much noise and laughter, staining the valuable carpet and the Baroness's dress. "Now goodbye, or you'll never get washed, and on my conscience will lie the greatest crime of a gentleman, want of cleanliness. So you advise me to put a knife to his throat?" "Most certainly, and hold it so that your hand will be near his lips. He will kiss the hand, and all will end well," said Vronsky. "Then we meet at the French Theater tonight." And her dress rustling, she vanished. Kamerovsky rose also, and without waiting for him to go, Vronsky shook hands with him and went to his dressing room. While he was washing, Paderewski in a few words described his own position in so far as it had changed. Since Vronsky went away, he had no money at all. His father had said he would not give him any and would not pay his debts. His tailor and another creditor were threatening him with arrest. His CO had announced to him that if these scandals continued, Paderewski would have to resign. He was sick to death of the Baroness, especially because she was always wanting to give him money. But there was another he would let Vronsky see her, who was charming, wonderful, of severely oriental type, in the style of the slave Rebecca. You know, he had also had a quarrel with Berkachov, who wished to send his seconds, but of course, nothing would come of it. But in general, everything was first-rate and extremely jolly. And without letting his friend go into details of his position, Petritsky began telling him all the interesting news, listening to Petrovsky's familiar tales in the familiar surroundings of the house he had lived in for 3 years. Vronsky experienced the satisfaction of returning to his customary careless Petersburg life. Impossible, he cried, releasing the pedal of his washstand, which controlled a jet of water under which he was bathing his healthy ruddy neck. Impossible, he cried at the news that Lavro was under the protection of Mliev and had thrown up Furtnev, and he is still as stupid and self-satisfied. And what about Bsulukov? About Bsulukov, there's such a tale. Splendid, shouted Petritsky. You know his passion for balls. He never misses a single court ball. He went to a grand ball wearing one of the new helmets. Have you seen the new helmets? Oh, they're very good, much lighter. Well, he stood. But you're not listening. Yes, I am, replied Vronsky, rubbing himself with a bath towel. The Grand Duchess passed by with one of the ambassadors, and as his ill luck would have it, they were discussing the new helmets. The Grand Duchess wishes to show him one of them. She sees our dear Batulkov standing there. Petritsky imitated the pose. The Grand Duchess asks him for his helmet, but he won't let her have it. And what can this mean? They wink at him, nod, frown, to make him give it up. No, he stands there more dead than alive. Oh, just imagine it, that you what's-his-name wishes to take it from him, but he won't let go. The other snatches it away and hands it to the Grand Duchess. Here, this is one of the new ones, says the Grand Duchess, turning it over. And just fancy, out tumbles a pair, and sweets, 2 pounds of them. The dear fellow had collected them in his helmet. Vronsky shook with laughter, and long after, when he was already talking of other things, he again went off into roars of hearty laughter, showing his compact row of strong teeth at the remembrance of the helmet. Having heard all the news, Vronsky, with the help of his valet, put on his uniform and went to report himself. After that, he intended to go to see his brother and to see Betsy, and to pay a few calls in order to begin visiting the set in which he could meet Anna Karenina. As usual in Petersburg, he left the house not to return till late at night. Part 2, Chapter 1. Toward the end of the winter, a consultation was held at the Shabatskys, which was intended to ascertain the state of Kitty's health and to decide what should be done to restore her failing strength. She was ill, and with the approach of spring grew worse. Their own doctor prescribed cod liver oil, then iron, and then nitrate of silver, but as none of them did her any good, and as he advised her to go abroad for the spring, they sent for a celebrated specialist. The celebrated specialist, a very handsome man, and by no means old, insisted on sounding the invalid. He with particular pleasure, as it seemed, insisted that a maidenly sense of shame is only a relic of barbarism, and that nothing is more natural than for a man still in his prime to handle a young woman's naked body. He considered this natural because he did it every day, and did not, it seemed to him, either feel or think anything wrong when he did it. He therefore considered the feeling of shame in a girl to be not only a relic of barbarism, but an insult to him they had to submit for. Although all the doctors studied in the same schools and from the same books and knew the same sciences, and though some said that this celebrated man was a bad doctor at the Princess Sherobetskaya's, and in her said it was for some reason assumed that he alone had a quite special knowledge, and he alone could save Kitty. After having carefully examined and sounded the agitated invalid, who was stupefied with shame, the celebrity having carefully washed his hands, stood in the drawing room talking to the prince frowned and coughed as he listened to the doctor, as a man who had lived in the world and was neither stupid nor ill. The prince did not believe in medicine, and in his heart was vexed at this fast, especially as he himself was probably the only one who thoroughly understood the cause of Kitty's illness. What a windbag, he thought, as he listened to the celebrated doctor's chatter about Kitty's symptoms. The doctor, meanwhile, found it hard not to show his contempt for the old fellow, and with difficulty descended to the level of his comprehension. He saw that it was waste of time to talk to him, and that the head in this house was the mother. It was before her that he meant to spread his pearls. Just then the princess entered the room. With the family doctor, the prince moved away, trying not to show how absurd he thought the whole farce. The princess was confused and did not know what to do. She felt guilty. Toward Kitty, "Well, doctor, decide our fate," she said. "Tell me everything. Is there any hope?" She meant to ask, but her lips trembled, and she could not utter that question, and only added, "Well, doctor, in a moment, princess, I will just have a talk with my colleague, and then I shall have the honor of giving you my opinion. Then we had better leave you." "Yes, you please." The princess left the room with a sigh. When the doctors were alone, the family doctor began timidly to express his opinion, which was that a tuberculosis process had begun, but etc. The celebrity listened, but in the midst of the speech, looked at his large gold watch. "Yes," said he, but the family doctor stopped respectfully in the middle of what he was saying. "We cannot, as you know, determine the beginning of a tuberculosis process. As long as there are no cavities, there is nothing definite to go by. But we may suspect it, and there are indications: bad appetite, nervous excitability, and so on. The question is this: when a tuberculosis process is suspected, what should be done to nourish the patient? But you know, in these cases there's always some hidden moral cause." The family doctor allowed himself to remark with a subtle smile. "Oh yes, that goes without saying," replied the celebrity, and again looked at his watch. "Excuse me, has the bridge over the Yauza been repaired? Or has one still to drive round?" he asked. "Oh, it has been repaired." "Well, then I can get there in 20 minutes. We were saying that the question is this: how to nourish the patient and strengthen the nerves. The two aims are connected, and we must act on both." "How about a journey abroad?" asked the family doctor. "I'm opposed to journeys abroad. You see, if a tuberculosis process has begun, which we don't know, a journey abroad will not help the case. Something is necessary which will nourish the patient and do no harm." And the celebrity explained his plan of a treatment with sodden water, the chief reason for prescribing this evidently being that it could do no harm. The family doctor listened attentively and respectfully to the end. "But in favor of a journey abroad, I should like to mention the change of habits and the removal from surroundings which awaken memories, besides which the mother wishes it," said he. "Oh, in that case let them go. Only those German quacks will do mischief. They must obey. However, let them go." He again glanced at his watch. "I must be going," he said, moving toward the door. The celebrity informed the princess his sense of what was fitting suggested this to him, that he would have to see the patient again. "What, another examination?" exclaimed the mother, horror-struck. "Oh no, I must only find out a few details." "Princess, if you please, doctor." And the mother, followed by the doctor, entered the room, in the middle of which Kitty was standing. Her thin cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were burning after the ordeal she had endured. When the doctor entered, she blushed all over, and her eyes filled with tears. Her whole illness and the treatment appeared to her stupid and even ridiculous. Her treatment seemed to her as absurd as piecing together the bits of a smashed vase. Her heart was broken. Why did they want to dose her with pills and powders? But she did not want to pain her mother, especially as her mother considered herself to blame. "Sit down, please, princess," said the celebrity. He sat down opposite to her, smiling, felt her pulse, and again began asking tiresome questions. She answered him, but suddenly grew angry and rose. "Excuse me, doctor, but really this won't lead to anything. You are asking me the same things 3 times over." The celebrity was not offended. "It's only the excitability of an invalid," he said to the mother after Kitty had gone out and I had finished, and to the princess as to an exceptionally intelligent woman. The doctor diagnosed Kitty's condition in learned language and concluded with directions how the unnecessary waters were to be drunk. In reply to the question whether they should go abroad, the doctor thought deeply, as if solving a difficult problem, and at last he decided that they should go, but should not believe the quacks, and when in doubt should always refer to him. It was just as if something pleasant had happened when the doctor had gone, and Kitty to pretended to be cheerful. She often, now almost always, had to pretend. "Really, Mama, I'm quite well. But if you wish to travel, let us go." And trying to appear interested in the journey, she began to talk about the preparations for it. Chapter 2. Just after the doctor had left, Dolly came. She knew that there was to be a consultation that day, and though she had only recently got up after a confinement, she had given birth to a daughter at the end of the winter, and though she had many troubles and cares of her own, she left her baby and another little girl of hers, who was ill and called to hear Kitty's fate, which was to be decided that day. "Well, how is she?" she said, entering the drawing room without removing her bonnet. "You are all cheerful, so it must be all right." They tried to tell her what the doctor had said, but it turned out that though he had spoken very fluently and at great length, it was impossible to reproduce what he had said. The only thing of interest was that it had been decided they should go abroad. Dolly could not suppress a sigh. Her best friend, her sister, was going away, and as it was, her life was not a bright one. Her relations with her husband after their reconciliation had become humiliating. Anna's soldering had not proved durable, and the family harmony had broken again. At the same place there was nothing definite, but Oblonsky was hardly ever at home. There was hardly ever any money, and suspicions of his infidelity continually tormented Dolly, who tried to repel them, fearing the already familiar pangs of jealousy. The first explosion of jealousy once past could not be repeated. Not even the discovery of an act of infidelity could again affect her as it had done the first time. Such a discovery could now only deprive her of her accustomed family life, and she let herself be deceived, despising him and especially herself for such weakness. Added to this, the care of a large family worried her continually. Either something went wrong with the feeding of the baby, or the nurse left, or as now one of the children fell ill. "And how are you all getting on?" asked her mother. "Mama, we have plenty of trouble of our own. Lily has fallen ill, and I'm afraid it's scarlet fever. I have come out today to hear the news, because I shall not come out at all if, which God forbid, it really is scarlet fever." The old prince came out of his study after the doctor had gone, and after giving his cheek to Dolly and greeting her, he turned to his wife. "Well, have you made up your minds to go? And what are you going to do with me?" "I think you should stay behind, Alexander," replied his wife. "As you please, Mama. Why should not Papa come with us?" said Kitty. "It would be pleasanter for him and for us too." The old prince rose and stroked Kitty's hair. She lifted her face and, forcing a smile, looked up at him. She always felt that he understood her better than anyone else in the family. Though he did not speak much to her, being the youngest, she was his favorite, and it seemed to her that his affection gave him insight. When her gaze now met his kindly blue eyes looking steadily at her, it seemed to her that he saw right through her and knew all the trouble that was in her. She bent toward him, blushing and expecting a kiss, but he only patted her on the head and remarked, "These stupid chignal one can't get at one's real daughter, but only caresses the hair of expired females." "Well, Dolly," he said, turning to his eldest daughter, "and what is your prodigal about?" "Nothing particular, Papa," answered Dolly, understanding that he referred to her husband. "He's always out. I hardly see him." She could not resist adding, with an ironical smile, "And has he not yet gone to the country to sell the forest?" "No, he is always preparing to go, dear me," said the prince, "and so I am also to prepare. I am all obedience," he said to his wife as he sat down again. "And look here, Kate," he went on, turning to his youngest daughter, "you must wake up one fine morning and say to yourself, 'Why, I'm quite well and happy, and we'll go out to walk in the frost again with Papa.'" Her father's words seemed very simple, but they made Kitty feel as confused and flurried as a detected criminal. "Yes, he knows and understands it all, and in these words is telling me that though I am ashamed, I must get over my shame." She could not gather spirit enough to reply. She made an attempt, but suddenly burst into tears and ran away. The princess flew at her husband. "That comes of your jokes, you always," and she began reproaching him. The prince listened for some time to her rebukes in silence, but his face frowned more and more. "She is so pitiful, poor thing, so pitiful. And you don't feel that every allusion to what has caused it hurts her." Oh dear, to be so mistaken in anyone," said the princess, and from the change in her tone, both Dolly and the prince knew that she was thinking of Vronsky. "I can't think why we have no laws to punish such horrid, ignoble people. Oh, it makes me sick to hear it," muttered the prince gloomily, rising as if he meant to go away, but stopping at the door. "The laws are there, my dear, and since you have invited it, I will tell you who is at fault for it all. You and no one but you. There always have been, and there still are laws against such fellows. Yes, and if nothing had been done that ought not to have been done, I, old as I am, would have challenged him, that fop. Yes, now go and dozer and call in these quacks." The prince appeared to have much more to say, but as soon as the princess heard his tone, she, as always happened in serious cases, gave in and became repentant. Alexander," she whispered, moving nearer, and bursting into tears. As soon as she began to cry, the prince quieted down and came up to her. That will do, you suffer. Do I know it can't be helped? There's no great harm done. God is merciful. Thank you. He went on no longer. Knowing what he was saying, and after responding to his wife's wet kiss, which he felt on his hand, he went out. When Kitty, in tears, had left the room, Dolly, with her motherly habit of mind, at once saw that here a woman's task lay before her, and prepared to fulfill it, she took off her bonnet, and having mentally rolled up her sleeves, prepared for action. While her mother was attacking her father, she tried to restrain the former as far as filial respect permitted. When the prince flared up, she kept silent, feeling shame for her mother and tenderness toward her father because of his immediate return to kindness. But when her father left the room, she was ready for the chief thing needful, which was to go to Kitty and comfort her. I wanted to tell you something long ago, Mama. Do you know that Levin wished to propose to Kitty? When he was here last, he told Stepan. Well, what of that? I don't understand. Perhaps Kitty rejected him. Did she not tell you? No, she told me nothing about either. She's too proud, but I know it is all because of that. Yes, and just imagine if she refused Lee Haven, and she would not have refused him if it had not been for that other I know. And then the other deceived her so dreadfully. It was too dreadful for the princess to think how much she was to blame in regard to her daughter, and she grew angry. Oh, I can't make anything out nowadays. Girls all want to trust to their own reason. They don't tell their mothers anything. And then, Mama, I will go to her. Go, am I preventing you? Chapter 3. On entering Kitty's little snuggery, a pretty pink room decorated with pure sax figures, as fresh, rosy, and gay as Kitty herself had been 2 months before, Dolly remembered how light-heartedly and with what love they two had arranged that room the year before. Her heart grew chill when she saw Kitty sitting on the low chair nearest the door, her eyes fixed on a corner of the carpet. Kitty glanced at her sister, but the cold and rather severe expression of her face did not change. I'm going home now, and she have to shut myself up, and you won't be able to come to me, said Dolly, sitting down beside her sister. I want to talk to you. What about? Asked Kitty, quickly lifting her face in alarm. What but your troubles? I have no troubles. Oh, come now, Kitty, do you think I can help knowing I know everything? And believe me, it is so unimportant. We have all passed through the same. Kitty was silent, and her face looked stern. He is not worthy of your suffering. For him, continued Dolly, going straight to the point. No, because he has despised me, said Kitty with a shaking voice. Don't speak, please don't speak. But who told you so? Nobody says so. I'm sure he was in love with you, and is still in love, but oh dear, these commiserations are what I dread most of all, cried Kitty, suddenly flaring up. She turned on her chair, blushed, and began rapidly moving her fingers, pressing now with one hand, and now with the other, the buckle of a belt she was holding. Dolly knew her sister's habit of fingering something when she was heated, and she knew how apt Kitty was to forget herself when in a passion, and to say much that was unpleasant and had better not have been said. She tried to pacify her, but it was too late. What do you want me to feel? What? Said Kitty quickly. That I was in love with a man who wouldn't have anything to do with me, and that I am dying for love of him. And it is my sister who says that to me, my sister who imagines that she sympathizes with me. I don't want this commiseration and hypocrisy. Kitty, you are unfair. Why do you torment me? On the contrary, I see you are in distress. But Kitty, in her excitement, did not listen to her. There is nothing for me to grieve for or seek comfort about. I have enough pride never to let myself love a man who does not love me. But I'm not suggesting it. Only tell me frankly, said Dolly, taking her by the hand. Did Levin speak to you? The mention of Levin seemed to deprive Kitty of the last fragments of self-control. She jumped up from her chair, threw the buckle on the floor, and rapidly gesticulating with her hands, she began. What has Levin to do with it? I don't understand why you need torment me. I have said, and I repeat, I will never do what you are doing, returning to a man who has betrayed you and has loved another woman. I can't understand it. You may do it, but I can't. Having said these words, she looked at her sister, and seeing that Dolly remained silent with her head bowed sadly, Kitty, instead of leaving the room, as she had intended to do, sat down by the door, and hiding her face in her handkerchief, let her head sink down for a minute or two. There was silence. Dolly was thinking about herself. The humiliation, of which she was always conscious, was peculiarly painful when her sister touched on it. She had not expected such cruelty from her, and was angry with her, but suddenly she heard the rustle of a dress and a burst of suppressed sobbing. A pair of arms encircled her neck from below, and Kitty was kneeling before her. Dear, I am so unhappy," she whispered guiltily, and the sweet tear-stained face hid itself in the folds of Dolly's dress as if tears were the necessary lubricant without which the machine of mutual confidence could not work properly between the sisters. After having had a cry, they started talking of indifferent matters, and in so doing understood one another. Kitty knew that what she had said in her anger about the unfaithfulness of Dolly's husband and about her humiliation had cut her poor sister to the depths of her heart, but that she was forgiven while Dolly on her side learned all that she wanted to know. Her suspicions were confirmed, and she understood that Kitty's grief, her hopeless grief, was really caused by the fact that Levin had proposed to her and that she had rejected him. And now that Vronsky had deceived her, she was prepared to love Levin and to hate Vronsky. Kitty did not say a word of this. She spoke only of her state of mind. "I have no troubles whatever," she said when she had grown calm. "But can you understand that everything has become horrid, disgusting, and coarse to me, and above all I myself? You can't think what horrid thoughts I have about everything." "What horrid thoughts can you have?" asked Dolly, smiling. "The very nastiest and coarsest. I can't tell you. It is not grief, not dullness, but much worse. It is as if all that was good in me had hidden itself, and only what is horrid remains. How am I to tell you?" she continued, noticing perplexity in her sister's eyes. "Papa began to speak to me just now. It seems to me that he thinks that all I need is to get married. Mama takes me to a ball, and it seems to me she only takes me there to marry me off as quickly as possible and get rid of me. I know it is not true, but I can't get rid of the idea. I can't bear to see the so-called eligible men. I always think they're taking my measure. Formerly, to go anywhere in a ball dress was just a pleasure to me. I used to like myself in it, but now I feel ashamed and uncomfortable. Well, what is one to do?" The doctor. Kitty became confused. She was going to say that since this change had come over her, Oblonsky had become intolerably disagreeable to her, and that she could not see him without having the coarsest and most monstrous fancies. "Well, you see, everything appears to me in the coarsest and most horrid aspect," she continued. "That is my illness. Perhaps it will pass, but don't think I can't. I only feel comfortable with children, only in your house. What a pity you can't come to see us. But I will come. I have had scarlet fever, and I will persuade Mama to let me." And Kitty insisted on having her own way, went to her sisters and nursed the children, all through the scarlet fever that really attacked them. The two sisters nursed all the 6 children successfully through the illness, but Kitty's health did not improve, and in Lent the Sherbatskys went abroad. Chapter for the highest Petersburg society is really all one. All who belong to it know and even visit one another. But this large circle has its subdivisions. Anna Arkadyevna had friends and close connections in 3 different sets. One of these was her husband's official set, consisting of his colleagues and subordinates, who in most varied and capricious ways were connected and separated by social conditions. Anna found it hard now to recall the feeling of almost religious respect she had at first felt for these people. Now she knew them all as well as the inhabitants of a provincial town know one another. She knew the habits and weaknesses of each of them, and where the shoe pinched this or that foot, she knew their relations to one another and to the governing center. She knew who sided with whom and how and by what means each supported himself, and who agreed or disagreed with whom and about what. But in spite of admonitions and advice from the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, this bureaucratic circle of male interests could not interest Anna, and she avoided it. Another circle with which Anna was intimate was that through which Karenin had made his career. The center of that circle was the Countess Lydia Ivanovna. It consisted of elderly, plain, philanthropic, and pious women, and clever, well-educated, ambitious men. One of the clever men who belonged to it called it the conscience of Petersburg society. Karenin set great value on this circle, and Anna, who knew how to get on with everyone, had during the first part of her life in Petersburg made friends in it too. But now on her return from Moscow, that circle became unbearable to her. It seemed to her that she and all of them were only pretending, and she felt so bored and uncomfortable in that society that she visited Lydia Ivanovna as rarely as possible. The third circle with which Anna was connected was society in the accepted meaning of the word, the society of balls, dinner parties, brilliant toilette. The society which clung to the court with one hand lest it should sink to the demi-monde. For this, the members of that society thought they despised, though its tastes were not only similar, but identical with their own. Anna was connected with the set through the Princess Betsy Vaskaya, the wife of her cousin, who had an income of 120,000 rubles a year, and who from the time Anna first appeared in society had particularly liked her, made much of her, and drawn her into her own set, making fun of that to which the Countess Lydia Ivanovna belonged. When I am old and ugly, I will become like that, Betsy used to say. But for you, a young and beautiful woman, it is too early to settle down in that almshouse. At first, Anna had avoided the Princess Versikia's set as much as she could, because it demanded more expense than she could afford, and also because she really approved more of the other set. But after her visit to Moscow, all this was reversed. She avoided her moral friends and went into grand society. There she saw Vronsky and experienced a tremulous joy when meeting him. She met him most frequently at Betsy's, who was a Vronsky herself, and his cousin Vronsky went everywhere where he had a chance of meeting Anna and spoke to her of his love whenever he could. She gave him no encouragement, but every time they met there sprang up that feeling of animation which had seized her in the train on the morning when she first saw him. She was aware that when they met, joy lit up her eyes and drew her lips into a smile, but she could not hide the expression of that joy. At first, Anna sincerely believed that she was displeased with him for allowing himself to persecute her. But soon after her return from Moscow, having gone to a party where she expected to meet him, but to which he did not come, she clearly realized by the sadness that overcame her that she had been deceiving herself, and that his persecution supplied the whole interest of her life. A famous prima donna was giving her second performance, and all high society was at the opera house. Vronsky, from the front row of the stalls, seeing his cousin, went to her box without waiting for the interval. "Why did you not come to dinner?" she said, adding with a smile, and so that only he could hear her, "I am amazed at the clairvoyance of lovers. She was not there, but come in after the opera." Vronsky looked at her inquiringly. She nodded, and he thanked her by a smile and sat down beside her. "And how well I remember your ridicule," continued the Princess Betsy, who took particular pleasure in following the progress of this passion. "What has become of it all? You are courted, my dear fellow." "I wish for nothing better than to be caught," replied Vronsky with his calm, good-natured smile. "To tell the truth, if I complain at all, it is only of not being caught enough. I am beginning to lose hope." "What hope can you have?" said Betsy, offended on her friend's behalf. "I don't know, but in her eyes little sparks twinkled, which said that she understood very well, and just as he did. "What hope? He might have none whatever," said Vronsky, laughing and showing his close-set teeth. "Excuse me," he added, taking from her hand the opera glasses, and he set to work to scan across her bare shoulder the row of boxes opposite. "I am afraid I am becoming ridiculous." He knew very well that he ran no risk of appearing ridiculous either in Betsy's eyes or in the eyes of society people generally. He knew very well that in their eyes the role of the disappointed lover of a maiden or of any single woman might be ridiculous, but the role of a man who was pursuing a married woman and who made it the purpose of his life at all costs to draw her into adultery was one which had in it something beautiful and dignified and could never be ridiculous. So it was with a proud, glad smile lurking under his mustache that he put down the opera glasses and looked at his cousin. "And why did you not come to dinner?" she said admiringly. "I must tell you about that. I was engaged, and with what do you think? I'll give you 100 or 1,000 guesses and you won't find out. I was making peace between a husband and a fellow who'd insulted his wife." "Yes, really? Well, and did you succeed?" "Nearly." "You must tell me all about it," she said, rising. "Come back in the next interval." "I can't. I'm going to the French theater." "What from Nilsson?" asked Betsy, quite horrified, though she could not have distinguished Nilsson's voice from that of a chorus girl. "It can't be helped. I have an appointment there in connection with this same peacemaking of mine. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be saved," said Betsy, remembering that she had heard someone say something like that. "Well then, sit down and tell me about it." And she sat down again. Chapter 5. "It's rather improper, but so charming that I long to tell it," said Vronsky, gazing at her with laughing eyes. "I shan't mention names, so much the better. I shall guess them. Well then, listen. To gay young fellows were out driving officers of your regiment." "Of course I didn't say officers, but just two young men who had been lunching translate that not wisely, but too well it may be they were on their way to dine. With a comrade and in the highest spirits, they see that a pretty woman in a hired sledge is passing them, looking at them and laughing and nodding to them at any rate they think, so of course off they go after her, galloping full speed to there. Surprised, the lovely one stops at the door of the very house they are going to. She runs up to the top flat. They only manage to see a pair of red lips beneath a short veil and lovely little feet. You tell it with so much feeling that I think you yourself must have been one of the two. And what did you say to me just now? Well, the young men go into their comrade's flat. He was giving a farewell dinner there. They may really have drunk rather too much, as always happens at farewell dinners. At dinner they inquire who lives in the top flat. No one knows but their host's footman. In answer to their question whether girls live there, replies that there are a lot of them thereabouts. After dinner the young men go into the host's study to compose a letter to the fair stranger, and having written one full of passion and containing a declaration, they carry it upstairs themselves in order to explain anything that might not be quite clear in the letter. Why do you tell me such horrors? Well, they ring. A maid opens the door. They give her the letter and assure her that they are both so much in love that they will die at once on the doorstep. The maid, quite bewildered, carries on the negotiations. Suddenly a gentleman with sausage-shaped whiskers and as red as a lobster appears, announces that no one but his wife lives in that flat, and turns them both out. How do you know he had sausage-shaped whiskers? As you say, you just listened. Today I went to reconcile him. Well, what happened? This is the most interesting part. It turns out that the happy couple are a titular counselor and a titular counselor. As the titular counselor lodges a complaint, and I turn into a peacemaker. And what a peacemaker! I assure you, Talahern was nothing to me. What was the difficulty? You shall hear. We duly apologized. We are in despair. We beg to be forgiven for our unfortunate mistake. The titular counselor, with his sausages, begins to thaw, but also wishes to express his feelings, and as soon as he begins to express them, he begins to get excited and grows insulting. And again, I have to set all my diplomatic talents in motion. I agree that they acted badly, but beg you to consider that it was a mistake. Consider their youth, besides which the young men had just dined. You understand, they repent from the bottom of their hearts and ask you to forgive their fault. The titular counselor again softens. I am willing to forgive them, Count, but you must understand that my wife, a respectable woman, has been subjected to the rudeness and insults of these Hubbard Hoys, these scoundrel, and you must remember that one of the hobbled dahoys is standing there, and I have to reconcile them. Again I set my diplomacy going, and again, just as the whole business should be concluded, my titular counselor flies into a rage, gets red, his sausages stick out, and again I dissolve into diplomatic subtlety. Oh, you must hear this, cried Betsy, laughing and turning to a lady who was just entering the box. He has made me laugh so well, Bonchance, she added, giving Vronsky a finger that was not engaged in holding her fan, and with a movement of her shoulders, making the bodice of her dress that had risen a little slip down again, that she might be befittingly nude on returning to the front of the box into the glare of gaslight and the gaze of all eyes. Vronsky went to the French theater, where he really had to see the commander of his regiment, who never omitted a single performance there, to talk over this reconciliation business, which had occupied and amused him for the last 3 days. Pedersky, whom Vronsky was fond of, was mixed up in the affair, and so was young Prince Kedrov, a first-rate fellow and a capital comrade who had lately joined the regiment. Above all, the interests of the regiment were involved. Both officers belonged to Vronsky's squadron. Titular Counselor Wendon had been to see the commander and had lodged a complaint against the officers who had insulted his wife. His young wife, so Wendon declared, he'd been married 6 months, had been to church with her mother, and suddenly feeling unwell as a result of her interesting condition, was unable to stand any longer and took the first good sledge she could find. These officers in their sledge raced after her. She became frightened and, feeling still more unwell, ran up the stairs to her flat. Wendon himself, having returned from his office and hearing the front doorbell and voices went out, saw the tipsy officers with the letter and hustled them out. He requested that they should be severely punished. Now say what you like, the commander remarked to Vronsky, whom he had invited to his house. Pedersky is becoming impossible. Not a week passes without some scandal that counselor will not let the matter rest. He will go further with it. Vronsky realized how ungrateful a task it was that a duel was out of the question, and that everything must be done to soften the titular counselor and hush up the affair. The CO had called Vronsky in just because he knew him to be honorable and able, and above all a man who valued the honor of the regiment. After discussing the matter, they decided that Vronsky should go with Petrinsky and Kedorov to apologize to the counselor. Both the commander and Vronsky were aware that Vronsky's name and his badge as aide-de-camp to the emperor ought greatly to help in softening the titular counselor's feelings, and really these things had a partial effect, but the result of the peacemaking still remained doubtful. As Vronsky had explained, having reached the French theater, Vronsky went out into the foyer with the CO and informed him of his success or lack of success. After considering the whole question, the commander decided to let the matter drop, but for amusement he asked Vronsky for particulars of the interview and could not help laughing for a long time as he listened to the description of how the titular counselor suddenly again flared up at the recollection of some incident of the affair, and how Vronsky maneuvered so as to retire just at the last half word of reconciliation, pushing Petrinsky before him. A bad business, but most amusing. Kedorov cannot fight that good man, and so he was in a great rage, repeated the commander, laughing. But what do you think of Claire this evening? Wonderful, he went on, referring to the new French actress. However often one sees her, she is new each day. Only the French can do that. Chapter 6. Princess Betsy went home. Without waiting for the end of the last act, she had scarcely time to go to her dressing room, put powder on her long pale face and rub it off again, smarten herself up, and order tea to be served in the big drawing room before one carriage after another began to arrive at the door of her immense house on the Great Marseille. The visitors passed beneath the broad portico, and the massive hall porter, who in the mornings read a newspaper behind the glass panes of the front door for the edification of passers-by, now noiselessly opened this enormous door to admit them almost at one and the same time. The hostess, her hair rearranged and her face freshened up, entered at one door, and the visitors at another of the large, dark-walled drawing room with its thick carpets and brightly lit tables shining in the candle light, with white tablecloths, silver samovar, and translucent china. The hostess sat down beside the samovar and took off her gloves, the chairs being moved by the aid of unobtrusive footmen. The company settled down, separating into two circles, one with the hostess round the samovar, the other at the opposite end of the room, round the wife of an ambassador, a beautiful woman with black, sharply outlined eyebrows in a black velvet dress. The conversation in both circles, as always happens, at first hesitated for a few minutes, was interrupted by greetings, recognitions, and offers of tea, and seemed to be seeking something to settle on. She is wonderfully good as an actress. One sees that she has studied Kalbach, remarked Natasha in the circle round the ambassador's wife. Did you notice how she fell? Oh, please don't let us talk about Nilsson. It's impossible to say anything new about her, said a stout, red-faced, fair-haired lady who wore an old silk dress and had no eyebrows and no chin. This was the Princess Myakaya, notorious for her simplicity and the roughness of her manners, and nicknamed L'Enfant Terrible. The Princess Myakaya was seated midway between the two circles, listening and taking part in the conversation of both. This very same sentence about Kalbach has been repeated to me by 3 different people today, as if by arrangement. That sentence, I don't know why, seemed to please them very much. The conversation was broken by this remark, and it became necessary to find another topic. Tell us something amusing, but not malicious, said the ambassador's wife, a great adept at that kind of elegant conversation which the English call small talk. Turning to the attached, who was also at a loss what subject to start. People say that is very difficult, and that only what is malicious is amusing. He began with a smile. But I will try if you will give me a theme. The theme is everything. Once one has a theme, it is easy to embroider on it. I often think that the famous talkers of the last century would find it difficult to talk cleverly nowadays. We are all so tired of the clever things that was said long ago, interrupted the ambassador's wife laughingly. The conversation had begun very prettily, but just because it was too pretty, it languished again. They had to return to the one sure and never-failing resource, slander. Don't you think there is something Louis Cans about Pushkovich, said the attached, glancing at a handsome, fair-haired young man who stood by the tea table. Oh yes, he matches the drawing room. That is why he comes here so often. This conversation did not flag, since it hinted at what could not be spoken of in this room, namely the relations existing between Tushkovich and their hostess around the hostess and the samovar. The conversation, after flickering for some time in the same way between the three inevitable themes, the latest public news, the theater, and criticism of one's neighbor, also caught on. When it got to the last of these themes, slander. Have you heard that Maltese shaver woman, also not the daughter, but the mother, is having a Diablo Rose costume made for herself? You don't mean to say so? How delicious. I wonder that she, with her common sense, for she is not stupid, does not see how ridiculous she makes herself. Everyone had something disparaging to say about the unfortunate Maltese shaver, and the conversation began crackling merrily, like a kindling bonfire. The Princess Betsy's husband, a fat, good-natured man, an enthusiastic collector of engravings, hearing that his wife had visitors, entered the drawing room before going to his club. Stepping silently on the thick carpet, he approached the Princess Mayakaya. "How did you like Nielsen?" he inquired. "Oh, how can you steal on one like that? How you frightened me," said she in reply. "Please don't talk to me about the opera. You know nothing of music. I'd better descend to your level and talk about your majolica and engravings. Come now, tell me about the treasures you've picked up lately at the rag fair. Shall I show you? But you don't understand them." "Yes, let me see them. I have learned from those what is their name? The bankers. They have some splendid engravings. They showed them to us." "What, have you been to the Schutzbergs?" asked the hostess from her place by the samovar. "I have, monsieur. They asked my husband and me to dinner, and I was told that the sauce alone at that dinner cost 1,000 rubles, said the Princess Maya K loudly, feeling that everybody was listening. "And a very nasty sauce. It was to something green. We had to invite them, and I gave them a sauce that cost 85 kopecks and satisfied everyone. I can't afford 1,000 rubles sauces. She is unique," said the hostess. "Wonderful," said someone else. The effect produced by the Princess Maya Kaya's words was always the same, and the secret of that effect lay in the fact that, although she often, as at that moment, spoke not quite to the point, her words were simple and had a meaning in the society in which she lived. Words of that kind produced the effect of a most witty joke. The Princess Mayakaya did not understand why her words had such an effect, but was aware that they did, and availed herself of it, as while she was speaking everybody listened to her, and the conversation in the circle around the ambassador's wife stopped. The hostess wished to make one circle of the whole company, and turning to the ambassador's wife said, "Will you really not have a cup of tea? You should come and join us here." "No, we are very comfortable here," replied the ambassador's wife, smiling, and she continued the interrupted conversation. It was a very pleasant conversation. They were disparaging the Karenin's husband and wife. "Anna has changed very much since her trip to Moscow. There is something strange about her," said a friend of Anna's. "The chief change is that she has brought back with her the shadow of Alexei Vronsky," said the ambassador's wife. "Well, why not? Grimm has a fable called The Man Without a Shadow, about a man who lost his shadow as a punishment for something or other. I never could understand why it was a punishment, but for a woman to be without a shadow can't be pleasant." "Yes, but a woman with a shadow generally ends badly," said Anna's friend. "A Miran on your tongue," suddenly remarked the Princess Mayakaya, hearing these words. "Anna Karenina is a splendid woman. I don't like her husband, but I'm very fond of her." "Why don't you like her husband? He's such a remarkable man," said the ambassador's wife. "My husband says there are few statesmen like him in Europe. My husband tells me the same, but I don't believe it," replied the Princess Mayakaya. "If our husbands didn't talk, we should see things as they really are, and it's my opinion that Karenin is simply stupid. I say it in a whisper. Does this not make everything quite clear? Formerly, when I was told to consider him wise, I kept trying to, and thought I was stupid myself, because I was unable to perceive his wisdom. But as soon as I said to myself, he's stupid, only in a whisper, of course, it all became quite clear. Don't you think so? How malicious you are today." "Not at all. I have no choice. One of us is stupid, and you know it's impossible to say so of oneself. No one is satisfied with his position, but everyone is satisfied with his wit," remarked the attached, quoting some French lines. That's just it," rejoined the Princess Mayashia, turning quickly toward him. "But the point is that I won't abandon Anna to you. She is so excellent, so charming. What is she to do if everyone is in love with her? And follows her about like a shadow. But I don't even think of blaming her, honest friend said, justifying herself. If no one follows us about like a shadow, that does not prove that we have a right to judge her. Having snubbed honest friend handsomely, the Princess Myakaya rose with the ambassador's wife and joined those at the table, where there was a general conversation about the King of Prussia. Whom are you backbiting there? Asked Betsy. The Karenines. The princess was characterizing Karenine, replied the ambassador's wife with a smile, seating herself at the table. It's a pity we did not hear it, said the hostess, glancing at the door. Ah, here you are at last, she added, smilingly, addressing Vronsky as he entered the room. Vronsky not only knew everybody in the room, but saw them all every day, so he entered in the calm manner of one who rejoins those from whom he has parted only a short time before. Where do I come from? He said in reply to the ambassador's wife. There's no help for it. I must confess that I come from the Tatrabov. I have been there 100 times, and always with fresh pleasure. Excellent. I know it's a disgrace, but at the opera I go to sleep, while at the Bof I stay till the last minute, enjoying it tonight. And he named a French actress and was about to tell them something about her when the ambassador's wife stopped him with mock alarm. Please don't talk about those horrors. All right, I won't, especially as everybody knows those horrors and everybody would go there if it were considered the thing. As the opera is put in, the Princess Myakaya. Chapter 7. Steps were heard at the entrance, and the Princess Betsy, knowing that it was Anna, glanced at Vronsky. He was looking at the door with a strange new expression on his face. He gazed joyfully, intently, and yet timidly at the lady who was entering, and slowly rose from his seat. Anna entered the room holding herself as usual very erect, and without changing the direction of her eyes approached her hostess, walking with that quick, firm, yet light step which distinguished her from other society women. She shook hands smilingly, and with the same smile looked round at Vronsky. He bowed low and moved a chair toward her. Anna responded only by an inclination of the head, though she blushed and frowned, but immediately nodding rapidly to her acquaintances and pressing the hands extended to her, she turned again to her hostess. I have just been at the Countess Lydia's. I meant to come sooner, but could not get away. Sir John was there. He is very interesting. Oh, that missionary. Yes, he was telling us about Indian life. It was very interesting. The conversation interrupted by her entrance, again burnt up like the flame of a lamp that has been blown out. Sir John. Oh yes, Sir John the First. Have seen him. He speaks very well. The elder of Las Vegas is quite in love with him. And is it true that the younger of Laseva is going to be married to Topov? Yes, they say it's quite settled. I'm surprised at her parents. They say it's a love match. Love match? What antiquated ideas you have. Who talks of love nowadays? Said the ambassador's wife. What's to be done? That silly old fashion hasn't died out yet, said Vronsky. So much the worse for those who follow the fashion. I know of happy marriages, but only such as are founded on reason. Yes, but how often the happiness of marriage is founded on reason crumbles to dust, because the very passion that was disregarded makes itself felt later, said Vronsky. But by marriages founded on reason, we mean marriages between those who have both passed through that madness. It's like scarlet fever. One has to get it over, then someone should invent a way of inoculating love, like vaccination. When I was young, I was in love with a chorister, said Princess Myakaya. I don't know whether it did me any good. No, joking apart, I believe that to understand love one must first make a mistake and then correct it, said the Princess Betsy. Even after marriage, said the ambassador's wife archly. It is never too late to mend, said the attached, quoting the English proverb. Exactly, chimed in Betsy. One has to make mistakes and correct them. What do you think? She asked, addressing Anna, who with a scarcely discernible resolute smile was listening to this conversation. I think, replied Anna, toying with the glove she had pulled off. I think if it is true that there are as many minds as there are heads, then there are as many kinds of love as there are hearts. Vronsky had gazed at Anna, and with sinking heart waited to hear what she would say. He sighed as after a danger averted. When she had uttered these words, suddenly Anna addressed him. I have received a letter from Moscow. They write that Kitty Sherbatskaya is very ill. Really, said Vronsky, frowning. Anna glanced sternly at him. It does not interest you. On the contrary, it interests me very much. What exactly do they write, if I may ask? He inquired. Anna rose and went up to Betsy. Give me a cup of tea, she said, stopping behind Betsy's chair while Betsy was pouring out the tea. Vronsky went up to Anna. "What do they write?" he asked again. "I often think men don't understand honor, though they are always talking about it," said Anna, without answering his question. "I have long wanted to tell you," she added, and moving a few steps to a side table on which lay some albums, she sat down. "I don't quite understand your meaning," he said, handing her the cup. "I wanted to tell you," she began again, without looking at him, "that you have behaved badly, very badly." "Don't I know that I behaved badly? But who was the cause? Why say that to me?" she asked, looking severely at him. "You know why," he answered boldly and joyously, meeting her look and continuing to gaze at her. "It was not he, but she who became abashed." "That only proves you have no heart," she said, but her look said that she knew he had a heart, and that she therefore feared him. "What you have just referred to was a mistake, and not love." Anna shuddered and said, "Don't you remember that I forbade you to mention that word, that horrid word?" But then she felt that the one word forbade showed that she claimed certain rights over him, thereby encouraging him to speak of love. "I have long wanted to say that to you," she went on, looking resolutely into his eyes, her face all aglow and suffused with a burning blush. "And today I came on purpose, knowing I should meet you here. I have come to tell you that this must stop. I have never till now had to blush before anyone, but you make me feel as if I were guilty of something." He looked at her and was struck by the new spiritual beauty of her face. "What do you want of me?" he asked simply and seriously. "I want you to go to Moscow and beg Kitty's pardon," said she. "You don't want that," he replied. He saw that she was saying what she forced herself to utter, and not what she wished to say. "If you love me as you say you do," she whispered, "behave so that I may be at peace." His face brightened. "Don't you know that you are all my life to me? But peace I do not know and can't give to you, my whole being, my love. Yes, I cannot think about you and about myself separately. You and I are one to me, and I do not see before us the possibility of peace either for me or for you. I see the possibility of despair, misfortune, or of happiness. What happiness? Is it impossible?" he added with his lips only. But she heard. She exerted all the powers of her mind to say what she ought, but instead she fixed on him her eyes, filled with love, and did not answer at all. "This is it," he thought with rapture, "just as I was beginning to despair, and when it seemed as though the end would never come here. She loves me, she acknowledges it. Do this for me, never say such words to me, and let us be good friends." These were her words, but her eyes said something very different. "Friends we shall not be, you know that yourself. But whether we shall be the happiest or the most miserable of human beings rests with you." She wished to say something, but he interrupted her. "I ask only one thing. I ask the right to hope and suffer as I do now. But if even that is impossible, command me to disappear, and I will do it. You shall not see me if my presence is painful to you. I don't want to drive you away. Only don't change anything, leave everything as it is," he said with trembling voice. "Here's your husband." Indeed, just at that moment Karenin, with his deliberate, ungraceful gait, entered the drawing room. He glanced at his wife, and Vronsky went up to the hostess, and having sat down with a cup of tea, began talking in his deliberate and always clear tones, in his usual ironical way, ridiculing somebody. "Your hotel Rambu is in full, master," said he, glancing round the whole company, the Graces and the Muses. But the Princess Betsy could not bear that tone of his sneering. She called it in English, so like a clever hostess she at once led him into a serious conversation on universal military service. Karenin was immediately absorbed in the conversation and began defending the new law very earnestly against the Princess Betsy, who attacked at Vronsky, and Anna remained sitting at the little table. "This is becoming indecent," whispered a lady, indicating by a glance Vronsky, "Anna, and Anna's husband." "What did I tell you?" replied Anna's friend, and not these two ladies alone, but nearly all those present in the drawing room, even the Princess Myakaya and Betsy herself, several times glanced across at the pair who had gone away from the general circle, as if their having done so disturbed the others. Only Karenin did not once glance that way, and was not distracted from the interesting conversation in which he was engaged, noticing the unpleasant impression produced on everyone. The Princess Betsy maneuvered for someone else to take her place and to listen to Karenin, and she herself went up to Anna. "I am always amazed at your husband's clearness and exactitude of expression," she said. "The most transcendental ideas become accessible to me when he speaks." "Oh yes," said Anna, radiant with a smile of happiness, and not understanding a single word of what Betsy was saying and going across to the big table, she joined in the general conversation. After half an hour's stay, Karenin went up to his wife and suggested that they should go home together. But without looking at him, she answered that she would stay to supper. Karenin bowed to the company and went away. The Karenin's fat old Tartar coachman in his shiny leather coat was finding it hard to control the near gray horse that had grown restive with cold, waiting before the portico. The footman stood holding open the carriage door. The hall porter stood with his hand on the outer front door. Anna, with her deft little hand, was disengaging the lace of her sleeve, which had caught on a hook of her fur coat, and with bent head was listening with delight to what Vronsky, who accompanied her, was saying. Granted that you have not said anything, I don't demand anything, he was saying. But you know that it is not friendship. I want only one. Happiness is possible for me in life. The word you so dislike. Yes, love, love, she slowly repeated to herself. And suddenly, while releasing the lace, she added aloud, the reason I dislike that word is that it means too much for me, far more than you can understand. And she looked him in the face. Au revoir. She gave him her hand, and with her quick elastic step went past the hall porter and vanished into the carriage. A glance and the touch of her hand burned him. He kissed the palm of his hand where she had touched it and went home happy in the knowledge that in this one evening he had made more progress toward his aim than he had during the previous 2 months. Chapter 8. Karenin did not see anything peculiar or improper in his wife's conversing animatedly with Vronsky at a separate table, but he noticed that others in the drawing room considered it peculiar and improper. Therefore he also considered it improper and decided to speak to his wife about it. When he reached home, he went to his study as usual, seated himself in his easy chair, and opened a book on the paper seat at the place where his paper knife was inserted. He read till 1 o'clock, as was his wont, only now and then rubbing his high forehead and jerking his head as if driving something away. At the usual hour he rose and prepared for bed. Anna had not yet returned. With the book under his arm, he went upstairs, but tonight, instead of his usual thoughts and calculations about his official affairs, his mind was full of his wife and of something unpleasant that had happened concerning her. Contrary to his habit, he did not go to bed, but with his hands clasped behind his back started pacing up and down the rooms. He felt that he could not lie down till he had thought over these newly arisen circumstances. When Karenin had decided to talk the matter over with his wife, it had seemed to him quite easy and simple to do so. But now, when he began considering how to approach her, the matter appeared very difficult and complicated. He was not of a jealous disposition. Jealousy, in his opinion, insulted a wife, and a man should have confidence in his wife. Why he should have confidence, that is a full conviction that his young wife would always love him, he never asked himself. But he felt no distrust, and therefore had confidence, and assured himself that it was right to have it now, though his conviction that jealousy is a shameful feeling, and that one ought to have confidence, had not been destroyed. He felt that he was face to face with something illogical and stupid, and he did not know what to do. Karenin was being confronted with life, with the possibility of his wife's loving somebody else, and this seemed stupid and incomprehensible to him, because it was life itself. He had lived and worked all his days in official spheres which deal with reflections of life, and every time he had knocked up against life itself, he had stepped out of its way. He now experienced a sensation such as a man might feel who, while quietly crossing a bridge over an abyss, suddenly sees that the bridge is being taken to pieces and that he is facing the abyss. The abyss was real life. The bridge was the artificial life Karenin had been living. It was the first time that the possibility of his wife's falling in love with anybody had occurred to him, and he was horrified. He did not undress, but paced up and down with his even step on the resounding parquet floor of the dining room, which was lit by one lamp over the carpet of the dark drawing room, where a light was reflected only from a recently painted portrait of himself which hung above the sofa, and on through her sitting room, where the candles were burning, lighting up the portraits of her relatives and friends, and the elegant knick-knacks long familiar to him on her writing table. Through her room he reached the door of their bedroom, and then turned back again. From time to time he stopped generally on the parquet floor of the lamplit dining room, and thought, yes, it is necessary to decide and to stop it, to express my opinion of it, and my decision. Then he turned back again, but expressed what decision he asked himself in the drawing room and could find no answer. But after all, he reflected before turning into her room. What is it that has happened? Nothing at all. She had a long talk with him. Well, what of that? Are there not plenty of men with whom a woman may talk? Besides, to be jealous is to degrade myself and her, he said to himself as he entered her sitting room. But that consideration, which formerly had weighed so much with him, now had neither weight nor meaning. At the bedroom door he turned back, and as soon as he re-entered the dark drawing room, a voice seemed to whisper that it was not so, and that if others noticed, that showed that there must have been something for them to notice. And again he repeated to himself in the dining room, yes, it is necessary to decide and stop it and express my opinion. And again in the drawing room, at the turn into her room, he asked himself, decide what? And then what has happened? And he replied, nothing, and remembered that jealousy is a feeling which insults a wife. But in the drawing room he came again to the conviction that something had happened. His mind as well as his body performed a complete circle each time without arriving at anything new. He noticed this, rubbed his forehead, and sat down in her room. Here, as he looked at her table, at the malachite cover of her blotting book and an unfinished letter that lay there, his thoughts suddenly underwent a change. He began thinking about her, of what she thought and felt. For the first time he vividly pictured to himself her personal life, her thoughts, her wishes. But the idea that she might and should have her own independent life appeared to him so dreadful that he hastened to drive it away. That was the abyss into which he feared to look. To put himself in thought and feeling into another being was a mental action foreign to Karenin. He considered such mental acts to be injurious and dangerous. Romancing. And what is most terrible of all, thought he, is that just now, when my work is coming to completion, he was thinking of the project he was then carrying through. When I need peace and all my powers of mind, just now this stupid anxiety falls on me. But what is to be done? I am not one of those who suffer anxiety and agitation, and have not the courage to look them in the face. I must think it over, come to a decision, and throw it off. He said aloud, the question of her feelings, of what has taken place or may take place in her soul, is not my business. It is the business of her conscience, and belongs to religion. Said he, feeling relieved at having found the formal category to which the newly arisen circumstances rightly belonged. Well then, thought he, the question of her feelings, and so on, are questions for her conscience, which cannot concern me. My duty is clearly defined as head of the family. I am the person whose duty is to guide her, and who is therefore partly responsible. I must show her the danger which I see, warn her, and even use my authority. I must speak plainly to her. What he would say to his wife took clear shape in Karenin's head. Thinking it over, he regretted having to expend his time and powers of mind on inconspicuous domestic affairs, but nevertheless clearly and definitely, as though it were an official report, the form and sequence of the speech he had to make shaped itself in his mind. I must make the following quite clear. First, the importance of public opinion and propriety. Secondly, the religious meaning of marriage. Thirdly, if necessary, I must refer to the harm that may result to our son. Fourthly, allude to her own unhappiness. And interlacing his fingers palms downwards, he stretched them, and the joints cracked. That movement, a bad habit of cracking his fingers, always tranquilized him and brought him back to that precision of mind which he now so needed. The sound of a carriage driving up to the front door was heard, and Karenin stood still in the middle of the room. A woman's steps were heard ascending the stairs. Karenin, ready to deliver his speech, stood pressing his interlaced fingers together, trying whether some of them would not crack again. One of the joints did crack. By the sound of her light step on the stair, he was aware of her approach, and though he was satisfied with his speech, he felt some apprehension of the coming explanations. Chapter 9. Anna walked in with bowed head, playing with the tassels of her hood. Her face shone with a vivid glow, but it was not a joyous glow. It resembled the terrible glow of a conflagration. On a dark night, on seeing her husband, she lifted her head, and as if awakening from sleep, smiled. Are you not in bed? What wonder, she said, throwing off her hood, and without pausing she went on to her dressing room. Alexei Alexandrovich, it's high time, she added from beyond the door. Anna, I must have a talk with you. With me, she said with surprise, coming back from the other room and looking at him. What is it? What about? She asked, seating herself. Well, let us have a talk if it is so important. But it would be better to go to bed, Anna said what came into her head, and hearing her own words, was astonished at her capacity for deception, how simple and natural her words sounded, and how really it seemed as if she were merely sleepy. She felt herself clothed in an impenetrable armor of lies, and that some unseen power was helping and supporting her. Anna, I must warn you, said he. Warn me? She asked. What about? She looked so naturally and gaily at him that one who did not know her as her husband did could not have noticed anything strange in the intonation or the meaning of her words. But for him who knew her, knew that when he went to bed 5 minutes late, she noticed it and asked the reason. Knew that she had always immediately told him all her joys, pleasures, and sorrows. For him, her reluctance to notice his state of mind or to say a word about herself meant much. He saw that the depths of her soul, till now always open, were closed to him. More than that, he knew from her tone that she was not ashamed of this, but seemed to be saying frankly, yes, it is closed, and so it should be, and will be in future. He now felt like a man who on coming home finds his house locked against him. But perhaps the key can still be found, thought Karenin. I wish to warn you, he said in low tones, that you may by indiscretion and carelessness give the world occasion to talk about you. Your too animated conversation tonight with Count Vronsky, he pronounced the name firmly, and with quiet deliberation attracted attention. As he spoke, he looked at her laughing eyes, terrible to him now and their impenetrability, and felt the uselessness and idleness of his words. You are always like that, she replied, as if not understanding him at all and intentionally taking notice only of his last words. One day you dislike my being dull, another day my being happy. I was not dull. Does that offend you? Karenin started and bent his hands to crack his fingers. Oh, please don't crack your fingers, I dislike it so, she said. Anna, is this you? Said he softly, making an effort and refraining from moving his hands. But whatever is the matter? She asked in a tone of comical surprise and sincerity. What do you want of me? Karenin paused and rubbed his forehead and eyes. He felt that instead of doing what he had meant to do and warning his wife that she was making a mistake in the eyes of the world, he was involuntarily getting excited about a matter which concerned her conscience and was struggling against some barrier of his imagination. This is what I intended to say, he continued coldly and calmly, and I ask you to listen to me. As you know, I consider jealousy an insulting and degrading feeling and will never allow myself to be guided by it. But there are certain laws of propriety which one cannot disregard with impunity. I did not notice it this evening, but judging by the impression created, all present noticed that you behaved and acted not quite as was desirable. Really, I don't understand at all, said Anna, shrugging her shoulders. It is all the same to him, she said to herself. But society noticed, and that disturbs him. You are not well, Alexei Alexandrovich, she added, rose and was about to pass out of the room. But he moved forward as if wishing to stop her. His face looked plainer and gloomier than she had ever yet seen it. Anna stopped, and throwing back her head and bending it to one side, she began with her quick hands to take out her hairpins. Well, I'm listening. What next? Said she quietly and mockingly. I am even listening with interest because I should like to understand what it is all about. As she spoke, she wondered at her quietly natural tone and at her correct choice of words. I have not the right to inquire into all the details of your feelings, and in general I consider it useless and even harmful to do so, began Karenin. By digging into our souls, we often dig up what might better have remained there unnoticed. Your feelings concern your own conscience, but it is my duty to you, to myself, and to God to point out to you your duties. Our lives are bound together not by men, but by God. This bond can only be broken by a crime, and that kind of crime brings its punishment. I don't understand anything, oh dear, and as ill luck will have it, I am dreadfully sleepy, said she, while with deft fingers she felt for the remaining pins in her hair. Anna, for God's sake, don't talk like that, he said mildly. Perhaps I am mistaken, but believe me that what I am saying I say equally for my own sake and for yours. I am your husband, and I love you. For an instant her head had drooped, and the mocking spark in her eyes had died away. But the word love aroused her again. Love, she thought, as if he can love. If he had never heard people talk of love, he would never have wanted that word. He does not know what love is, Alexei Alexandrovich. I really do not understand, she replied. Explain what you consider. Allow me to finish. I love you, but I am not talking of myself. The chief persons concerned are our son and yourself. I repeat, perhaps my words may seem quite superfluous to you. Perhaps they result from a mistake of mine. In that case, I ask your pardon. But if you feel that there are any grounds, however slight, I beg you to reflect, and if your heart prompts you to tell me." Karenin did not notice that he was saying something quite different from what he had prepared. "I have nothing to say besides," she added rapidly, and hardly repressing a smile. "It really is bedtime." Karenin sighed, and without saying anything more, went into the bedroom. When she went there, he was already in bed. His lips were sternly compressed, and his eyes did not look at her. Anna got into her bed, and every moment expected that he would address her. She was afraid of what he would say, and yet wished to hear it, but he remained silent. She lay waiting and motionless for a long time, and then forgot him. She was thinking of another. She saw him and felt her heart fill with excitement and guilty joy at the thought. Suddenly she heard an even quiet nasal sound. Like whistling. For a moment the sound he emitted seemed to have startled Karenin, and he stopped. But after he had breathed twice, the whistling recommenced with fresh and calm regularity. It's late, she whispered to herself and smiled. For a long time she lay still with wide open eyes, the brightness of which it seemed to her she could herself see in the darkness. Chapter 10. From that time a new life began for Karenin and his wife. Nothing particular happened. Anna went into society as before, frequently visiting the Princess Betsy, and she met Vronsky everywhere. Karenin noticed this, but could do nothing. She met all his efforts to bring about an explanation by presenting an impenetrable wall of merry perplexity externally. Things seemed as before, but their intimate relations with one another were completely changed. Karenin, strong as he was in his official activities, felt himself powerless here. Like an ox, he waited submissively, with bowed head, for the police, which he felt was raised above him. Each time he began to think about it, he felt that he must try again, that by kindness, tenderness, and persuasion there was still a hope of saving her and obliging her to bethink herself. Every day he prepared himself to have a talk with her, but each time he began to speak with her he felt the same spirit of evil and falsehood which had taken possession of her master him also, and he neither said the things he meant to nor spoke in the tone he had meant to adopt. He spoke involuntarily in his habitual half-bantering tone, which seemed to make fun of those who said such things seriously, and in that tone it was impossible to say what had to be said to her. Chapter 11. That which for nearly a year had been Vronsky's sole and exclusive desire, supplanting all his former desires, that which for Anna had been an impossible, dreadful, but all the more bewitching dream of happiness, had come to pass. Pale, with trembling lower jaw, he stood over her, entreating her to be calm, himself not knowing why or how. Anna, he said in trembling voice, Anna, for God's sake." But the louder he spoke, the lower she drooped her once proud, bright, but now dishonored head, and she writhed, slipping down from the sofa on which she sat to the floor at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet if he had not held her. "My God, forgive me," she said, sobbing, and pressing Vronsky's hand to her breast. She felt so guilty, so much to blame, that it only remained for her to humble herself and ask to be forgiven, but she had no one in the world now except him, so that even her prayer for forgiveness was addressed to him. Looking at him, she felt her degradation physically, and could say nothing more. He felt what a murderer must feel when looking at the body he has deprived of life. The body he had deprived of life was their love, the first period of their love. There was something frightful and revolting in the recollection of what had been paid for with this terrible price of shame. The shame she felt at her spiritual nakedness communicated itself to him. But in spite of the murderer's horror of the body of his victim, that body must be cut in pieces and hidden away, and he must make use of what he has obtained by the murder. Then, as the murderer desperately throws himself on the body as though with passion, and drags it and hacks it, so Vronsky covered her face and shoulders with kisses. She held his hand and did not move. Yes, these kisses were what had been bought by their shame. Yes, and this hand, which will always be mine, is the hand of my accomplice. She lifted his hand and kissed it. He knelt down and tried to see her face, but she hid it and did not speak. At last, as though mastering herself, she sat up and pushed him away. Her face was as beautiful as ever, but all the more piteous. "It's all over," she said. "I have nothing but you left. Remember that I cannot help remembering what is life itself to me for one moment of that bliss." "What bliss?" she said with disgust and horror, and the horror was involuntarily communicated to him. "For heaven's sake, not another word." She rose quickly and moved away from him. "Not another word," she repeated, and with a look of cold despair strange to him. She left him. She felt that at that moment she could not express in words her feeling of shame, joy, and horror at this entrance on a new life, and she did not wish to vulgarize that feeling by inadequate words later on the next day and the next. She still could not find words to describe all the complexity of those feelings, and could not even find thoughts with which to reflect on all that was in her soul. She said to herself, "No, I can't think about it now, later when I am calmer." But that calm necessary for reflection never came. Every time the thought of what she had done, and of what was to become of her, and of what she should do came to her mind, she was seized with horror and drove these thoughts away. "Not now, later when I am calmer," she said to herself. But in her dreams, when she had no control over her thoughts, a position appeared to her in all its shocking nakedness. One dream she had almost every night. She dreamt that both at once were her husbands and lavished their caresses on her. Alexei Alexandrovich wept, kissing her hands, saying how beautiful it is now, and Alexei Vronsky was there too, and he also was her husband, and she was surprised that formerly this had seemed impossible to her, and laughingly explained to them how much simpler it really was, and that they were both now contented and happy. But this dream weighed on her like a nightmare, and she woke from it filled with horror. Chapter 12. When Lyavin first returned from Moscow, and while he still started and blushed every time he remembered the disgrace of the refusal, he had said to himself, "I blushed and started like this when I was plowed in physics and had to remain in the second class, and in the same way I felt myself lost when I made a mess of my sister's affair that had been entrusted to me. And what happened now that years have passed, when I remember it, I am surprised that it could have grieved me so much. So it will be with this grief. Time will pass and I shall become indifferent." But 3 months passed, and he had not become indifferent to it, and to think of it still hurt him as it had done in the first days. He could not find peace, because he had so long dreamt of family life and felt so ripe for it, but was still unmarried, and further than ever from marriage he himself felt painfully what all those around him felt too, that it is not good for a man of his age to be alone. He remembered how, just before leaving for Moscow, he had said to Nikolai, his cowman, a naive peasant with whom he liked to talk, "Well, Nikolai, I want to get married," and how Nikolai had promptly replied, as on a matter about which there could be no doubt, "And it's high time, Konstantin Dmitri." But now he was further from marriage than ever. The place was unoccupied, and when in imagination he tried to put one of the girls he knew there, he felt that it was quite impossible. Moreover, the memory of her refusal and the part he had played in it tormented him with shame. However much he told himself that he was not at all to blame in that matter, the memory of it, together with other shameful memories, made him start and blush. There had been in his past, as in that of every man, actions which he realized were bad, and for which his conscience ought to have tormented him. But the recollections of those bad actions did not torment him nearly as much as these trivial yet shameful memories. These wounds never closed up, and among these recollections stood the memory of her refusal, and the pitiful role he must have played in the eyes of the others that evening. But time and work told. The painful memories became more and more covered over by the commonplace but important events of country life. Every week he thought less and less about Kitty. He waited impatiently to hear that she was married or was getting married soon, hoping that such news, like the drawing of an aching tooth, would quite cure him. Meanwhile spring had come, a glorious steady spring without the expectations and disappointments spring usually brings. It was one of these rare springs which plants, animals, and men alike rejoice in. This lovely spring roused Levin still more, and confirmed him in the determination completely to renounce the past in order to fashion his solitary life firmly and independently. Though he had not carried out many of the plans with which he had returned to the country from Moscow, he had held to the most important one, that of living a pure life, and he was not experiencing the shame which used to torment him when he had fallen, but was able to look people boldly in the face. Already in February he had received a letter from Maria Nikolaevna to say that his brother Nikolai's health was getting worse, but that he would not submit to any treatment in consequence of this news. Lyavin went to Moscow, saw his brother, and managed to persuade him to consult a doctor and go to a watering place abroad. He was so successful in persuading his brother and in lending him money for the journey, without irritating him that he was satisfied with himself in this respect besides his agricultural pursuits, which required special attention in spring, and besides reading Levin had another occupation he had that winter, begun writing a book on agriculture, the basis of which was that the character of the laborer was treated as a definite factor like climate and soil, and that therefore the conclusions of agricultural science should be deduced not from data supplied by climate and soil only, but from data of climate, soil, and the immutable character of the laborer, so that in spite of his solitary life, or rather because of it, his time was completely filled up only occasionally. He felt an unsatisfied desire to share with someone besides Agatha Mikhailovna the thoughts that wandered through his brain, for even with her he often discussed physics, agricultural theories, and especially philosophy, which last was her favorite subject. The spring had set in late during the last weeks of Lent. The weather had been clear and frosty, it thought, in the sunshine by day, but at night the thermometer went down to 16 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow was covered with a crust of ice so thick that carts could pass even where there were no roads. Easter found snow still on the ground, but on Easter Monday a warm wind began to blow. The clouds gathered, and for 3 days and nights warm stormy rain poured down. On the Thursday the wind fell, and a thick gray mist rose as if to hide the secret of the changes nature was carrying on beneath the mist. The snow waters rushed down, the ice on the river cracked and moved, and the turbid foaming torrents flowed quicker till on the first Sunday after Easter towards evening the mists dissolved, the clouds broke into fleecy cloudlets and dispersed, the sky cleared, and real spring was there in the morning. The bright rising sun quickly melted the thin ice on the water, and the warm air all around vibrated with the vapor given off by the awakening earth. Last year's grass grew green again, and new blades came up like needlepoints. Buds swelled on the gilded rose and currant bushes, and on the sticky spicy birch trees, and among the golden catkins, and on the willow branches the bees began to hum. The unseen larks burst into song above the velvety fresh green and the frozen stubble. The peewits began to cry above the water brought down by the storm and still flooding the low-lying places and marshes, and high up the cranes and geese flew uttering their spring call. The cattle, who had lost all but a few patches of their winter coats, began to low in the meadows. The crooked-legged lambs began to play round their bleating mothers, who were losing their wool. Swift-footed children began to run along the quickly drying paths marked with imprints of bare feet. The merry voices of women who were bleaching their linen began to chatter by the ponds, and the axes of peasants, getting ready their wooden plows and harrows, clicked in the yards. The real spring had come. Chapter 13. Levin put on his high boots, and for the first time a cloth coat instead of a fur, and went out to attend to his farm, stepping now on a piece of ice, now into the sticky mud. He crossed the stream of dazzling water. Spring is the time for making plans and resolutions, and Levin, like a tree which in the springtime does not yet know in which direction and what manner its young shoots and twigs, still imprisoned in their buds, will develop, did not quite know what work on his beloved land he was going to take in hand, but he felt that his mind was full of the finest plans and resolutions. First of all he went to the cattle yard. The cows had been let out there and warmed by the sunshine, their glossy new coats glistening. They were longing to be let out into the fields. After he had for a while admired his cows, all familiar to him to the minutest detail, Levin gave orders for them to be driven into the field, and for the calves to be let out into the yard. The cow herd ran away merrily to get ready, the dairy maids with twigs in their hands holding their skirts up over their bare white legs, not yet sunburned, splashed through the puddles into the yard, driving the calves, who were mad with the joy of spring, having gazed with admiration at the exceptionally fine calves born that year. The older ones were as big as peasants' cows, and Parva's 3-month-old calf was as big as a yearling. Levin gave orders to bring a trough of food for them and to put some hay into the racks outside, but it turned out that the racks, which had been put up in the yard and not used during winter, were broken. He sent for the carpenter, who was under contract to be with the threshing machine, but it turned out that he was mending the harrows, which should have been mended the week before Lent. This was very annoying to Levin. It was vexing that the careless farm management, against which he had struggled so many years with all his might, still continued. He found out that the racks which were not wanted in winter, had been taken into the farm horses' stable, and there had got broken as they were likely made, being meant only for the calves. Besides this, it proved that the harrows and all the agricultural implements, which he had ordered to be examined and mended in winter, for which purpose 3 carpenters had been specially engaged, had not been seen. 2 and the harrows were now being mended. When it was time to start harrowing, Levin sent for the steward, but instead of waiting went at once to look for him himself. The steward, in his astrakhan-trimmed coat, as radiant as everything else that day, was coming from the threshing ground, breaking a bit of straw in his hands. "Why is the carpenter not with the threshing machine? Oh, I meant to tell you yesterday that the harrows need mending. It's time to plow, you know. Why wasn't it done in winter? But what do you want with the carpenter? Where are the racks from the calves' yard? I have given orders for them to be put into their places." "What is one to do with such people?" said the steward, waving his arm. "It's not a case of such people, but of such a steward," said Levin, flaring up. "Tell me what I keep you for," he shouted. But remembering that this would not help matters, he stopped in the middle of what he was saying and only sighed. "Well, can we begin sowing?" he asked after a pause. "It will be possible beyond Torquino tomorrow or the day after. And the clover I have sent Vasily, he and Mishka are sowing, only I don't know if they'll get through. It's very sticky." "How many acres?" "Why not the lot?" shouted Levin. "That they were only sowing 16 instead of 50 acres. With clover was still more annoying to grow clover successfully. It was necessary, according to both theory and his own experience, to sow it as early as possible, almost before the snow had finished melting, and Levin could never get this done. "There's no one to do it. What are you to do with such people? 3 have not come, and now Simeon. Well, then you should have let the straw wait." "So I have, but where are the men?" 5 are making compost." He meant compost. "And 4 are turning the oats over. They might begin sprouting." Constantine Demetrius Levin understood very well that "might begin sprouting" meant that the English seed oats were already spoiling. Here again his orders had not been obeyed. "Oh dear, didn't I speak about it long ago in Lent?" "Oh, don't worry, it'll all be done in good time." Levin waved his hand angrily and went to the barn to look at the oats. Then he came back to the stable. The oats were not yet spoiled, but the men were turning them over with shovels, whereas they should have let them run down from the loft. Levin ordered them to do this, told off 2 of the men to help sow the clover, and got over his vexation with the foreman. Indeed, the day was so beautiful one could not long remain angry. Ignat he called to the coachman, who with sleeves rolled up was washing a carriage at the pump. "Saddle me." "Which, sir?" "Oh, Kolpek." "Oh, yes, sir." While the horse was being saddled, Levin again called the steward, who was hanging about within sight, and ordered to make it up with him, and began to talk about the spring work that lay before them, and his plans for the estate. Carting manure must be started early, so that it should be over before the first hay harvest, and the far field will have to be plowed continually so as to keep the earth clean. "We must hire labor for the hay harvest, and not pay in kind." The foreman listened attentively and evidently tried to approve of his master's plans, but his face still wore that hopeless and despondent expression so familiar to Levin. This expression seemed to say, "That's all very well, but it will be as God wills." Nothing grieved Levin so much as this manner, but it was a manner common to all the numerous stewards he had employed. They all took up the same attitude toward his plans, and therefore he now no longer grew angry with them, but he was grieved, feeling all the more stimulated to resist this, so to say, elemental force, for which he could find no other name. "But as God wills, which always obstructed him, we'll see if we can manage it," said the steward. "Why should you not manage it?" "Oh, we must have at least 15 more laborers. But you see they don't come, or some came today." But they wanted 70 rubles each for the summer. Levin was silent. That force was opposing him again. He knew that try as they would, they had never managed to get more than from 37 to 40 laborers at the proper price. 40 could be hired, but never more than 40. Yet all the same he could not but continue the struggle. "Send to Suri and to Shaprov. If they don't come, we must try and find men." "I'll send right enough," said Vasily Fedorich the steward despondently. "But the horses too are getting weak. We will buy some more. But don't I know," he added, laughing, "that you always want less of everything, and worse. However, this year I will not let you have your way. I'll see to everything myself. You don't sleep much as it is. I think it's always pleasanter for us when the master's eye is on us. Then it's down in the Birch Valley, that they are sowing the clover. I'll ride over and see, said Levin, mounting the little light bay horse Kolpik, which the coachman had brought. You won't be able to cross the brook, Constantine Demetrius the coachman called out. Well, then I'll go through the forest. And Levin rode across the muddy yard and out of the gate into the field at a brisk amble, his fresh little horse snorting at the puddles and pulling at the bridle. If he had felt light-hearted in the cattle and farmyards, he felt still more so in the fields, gently swayed by the ambling pace of his good little horse and drinking in the warm smell, with the freshness of snow and air in it. He rode through the forest over the crumbling, sinking snow that melted at each footstep, and rejoiced at the sight of each one of his trees, with its swelling buds and the moss reviving on its bark. When he had passed the forest, a vast expanse of velvety green unrolled before him, without a single bare spot, and only sprinkled here and there in the hollows with patches of unmolted snow. He was not irritated either by the sight of a peasant's horse and colt treading down the young growth he told a peasant he met to drive them off, nor by the jeering and stupid answer the peasant Epat, whom he happened to meet, gave him in reply to his question. Well, Epat, will it soon be time to sow? We must plow first, Constantine Demetrius said. Epad, the further he went the happier he felt, and all sorts of plans for his estate, each better than the last, presented themselves to him. To plant rows of willows with a southern aspect on all the fields, so that the snow should not remain long under them, to divide the fields, tilling 6 and keeping 3 under grass, to build a new cattle yard at the further end of the field, to dig a pond, and to make folds for the cattle for manuring purposes. Then he would have 300 dasyatnas of wheat, 100 of potatoes, and 150 of clover, and not a single dasyatina exhausted, dreaming such dreams, carefully guiding his horse so as not to trample down his young growth. He rode up to the laborers who were sowing the clover. The cart with the seed was standing not on the border, but in a field of winter wheat, which was being cut up by the wheels and trampled by the horses' feet. Both the laborers were sitting on the narrow path between the fields, probably sharing a pipe of tobacco. The earth in the cart with which the seeds were mixed was not rubbed fine, but was pressed or frozen into lumps. On seeing the master, the laborer Vasily moved toward the cart, and Mishka began to sow. This was not right, but Levin seldom got angry with the hired men. When Vasily came up, Levin told him to take the cart and horse onto the border. It won't matter, sir, the wheat will recover. Please don't argue, said Levin, but do as you're told. Oh yes, sir, answered Vasily, and took hold of the horse's head. But the sowing, Constantine Demetrius, is getting on first rate, he said, making up to the master. Only the walking is dreadful. You drag 1/2 weight on your boots. And why has not the earth been sifted, said Levin. Oh, but we crumble it up, said Vasily, taking a handful and rubbing the earth between his palms. Vasily was not to blame that they had given him unsifted earth, but still it was annoying, having more than once successfully tested a patent remedy for conquering vexation and making all that seemed wrong right again. Levin employed it now. He looked at the strides Mishka took, dragging the enormous lumps of earth that stuck to his feet. Dismounted, took the seed basket from Vasily, and prepared to sow. Where did you stop? Vasily pointed to a mark with his foot, and Levin began scattering the seeds and earth as best he could. It was hard walking, and having done a row, Levin, wet with perspiration, stopped and gave back the basket. Mine, sir, and don't scold me for this row when summer comes, said Vasily. Why, said Levin, merrily, feeling that his remedy was acting well. Oh, you'll see when the summer comes. You'll distinguish it. You just look where I sowed last spring, how regularly I scattered it over. Why, constantly, Demetrius, I don't think I could try harder if I was working for my own father. I don't like to do things badly myself, and I see that others don't. What's good for the master is good for us too. When one looks over there, it makes one's heart rejoice, said Vasily, pointing to the field. Fine spring, isn't it, Vasily? It's a spring such as the old men don't remember. I've been home, and my old father also has sown 3 measures of wheat. They say it's caught up the rye. And have you been sowing wheat long? Why, it was you who taught us to sow it the year before last. You gave me a bushel of seed yourself. We sowed 1/4 of it and sold the rest. Well, mind and rub the lumps, said Levin, going up to his horse, and keep an eye on Mishka, and if the clover comes up well, you shall have 50 kopecks for each dazina. Thank you kindly. We are very grateful to you. As it is, Levin mounted his horse and rode to the field where clover had been sown the year before, and to another which was deeply plowed and ready for sowing the spring wheat. The clover was coming on splendidly. It was already reviving and steadily growing green among last year's wheat stubble. The horse sank into the ground up to its pasterns and drew each foot out of the half-thawed earth with a smacking noise. It was quite impossible to ride over the deeply plowed field. The earth bore only where there was still little ice in the thawed furrows. The horse's legs sank in above its pasterns. The plowed land was in excellent condition. It would be possible to harrow. And so in a couple of days, everything was beautiful and gay. Leavin rode back by the way that led across the brook, hoping that the water would have gone down, and he did manage to ford the stream, scaring to ducks. In so doing, there must be some snipe, he thought, and just at the turning to his house he met the keeper, who confirmed his supposition. Levin ran on at a trot so as to have dinner and get his gun ready for the evening. Chapter 14. As Levin, in the highest spirits, was nearing the house, he heard the sound of a tinkling bell approaching the main entrance. Why, that must be someone from the station. He thought they would just have had time to get here from the Moscow train. Who is it? Can it be Brother Nikolai? He did say. Perhaps I'll go to a watering place, or perhaps I'll come to you for a moment. He felt frightened and disturbed, lest his brother's presence should destroy the happy frame of mind that the spring had aroused in him. But he was ashamed of that feeling, and immediately, as it were, opened out his spiritual arms, and with tender joy expected, and now hoped with his whole soul, that it was his brother. He touched up his horse, and having passed the acacia trees, saw a hired 3-horse sledge coming from the station, and in it a gentleman in a fur coat. It was not his brother. Oh, if only it's some nice fellow with whom one can have a talk, he thought. He cried joyfully, lifting both arms. Here's a welcome guest. Well, I am glad to see you, he exclaimed. Recognizing a Banksy, I shall know now for certain whether she is married or when she will be, thought Levin. And on this lovely day he felt that the memory of her did not hurt him at all. You did not expect me, said Blonsky, getting out of the sledge with mud on his nose, cheek, and eyebrows, but beaming with cheerfulness and health. I have come to see you, that's one thing, he said, embracing and kissing Leavin. To get some shooting, that's 2, and to sell the Ergo Shavo forest, that's 3. That's grand, and what a spring we're having. How did you manage to get here in a sledge? It would have been worse still on wheels. Konstantin Demetrius, said the driver, whom Levin knew well. I am very, very glad to see you, said Levin with a sincere smile. Joyful as a child's, he showed his guest into the spare bedroom, where Oblonsky's things, his bag, a gun in a case, and a satchel with cigars, were also brought, and leaving him to wash and change, Levin went to the office to give orders about the plowing and the clover. Agatha Mikhailovna, always much concerned about the honor of the house, met him in the hall with questions about dinner. Oh, do just as you please, only be quick, he said, and went out to see the steward. When he returned, Oblonsky, fresh and clean, with hair brushed and face radiant with smiles, was just coming out of his room, and they went upstairs together. How glad I am to have come to you. Now I shall be able to understand what the mysteries you perpetrate here consist of. Oh, but seriously, I envy you. What a house, and everything so splendid, so light, so gay, said Oblonsky, forgetting that it was not always spring and bright weather there as on that day, and your nurse quite charming. A pretty housemaid with a little apron would be preferable, but with your severe and monastic style, this one is more suitable. Oblonsky had much interesting news to tell, and one item of special interest to Levin was that his brother Sergei Ivanitch intended to come and stay in the country with him that summer. Not a word did Oblonsky say about Kitty or about any of the Chebatskys. He only delivered greetings from his wife. Levin was grateful to him for his delicacy and was very glad of his visit as usual. During his solitude, a mass of thoughts and feelings he could not express to those around had collected in his mind, and now he poured out to Oblonsky the poetic joy of spring, his failures, his plans concerning the estate, his thoughts and remarks about the books he had read, and especially the idea of his own book, the basis of which, though he did not notice it himself, was a criticism of all previous works on agriculture. Oblonsky, always pleasant and quick at understanding everything from a hint, was especially pleasant on this visit. There was a new trait in him which Levin noticed, and was flattered by. A kind of respect and a sort of tenderness toward him. The efforts of Agatha Mikhailovna and the cook to make the dinner especially nice resulted only in both the hungry friends sitting down to a snack and having to appease their hunger with hors d'oeuvres of bread and butter, smoked goose, and pickled mushrooms, and in Levin's ordering the soup to be served without waiting for the pasties with which the cook intended to astonish the visitor. But Oblonsky, though used to very different dinners, found everything delicious: the herb beer, the bread and butter, and especially the smoked goose and pickled mushrooms, the nettle soup, and the fowl with melted butter sauce, the creamine white wine. Everything was delicious. Everything was excellent. Splendid, splendid, he said, lighting a thick cigarette after the joint. I seem to have come to you as one lands from a noisy steamer onto a peaceful shore. So you maintain that the laborer should be studied as one of the factors which should decide the choice of agricultural methods. You know, I'm quite an outsider in these matters, but I should think this theory in its application ought to influence the laborer to yes. But wait a bit, I'm not talking about political economy, but about the science of agriculture. It should resemble the natural sciences and should examine existing phenomena, including the laborer with his economic and ethnographic. At that moment, Agatha Mikhailovna came in with some jam. Agatha Mikhailovna, said Oblonsky, kissing the tips of his plump fingers. What smoked goose? You have what herb brandy? But what do you think, Constantine? Is it not time? He added. Yevon glanced out of the window at the sun, which was setting behind the bare trees of the forest. High time, Kuzma, tell them to harness the trap, he said, and ran downstairs. Oblonsky went down and himself carefully took the canvas cover off the varnished case, opened it, and set to work to put together his valuable gun, which was of the newest type. Kuzma, already scenting a substantial tip, did not leave Oblonsky for a moment. He put on his stockings and his boots for him, and Oblonsky willingly allowed him to do so. Constantine, please leave word that if the dealer Ryabinin comes, I told him to come here today. They should ask him in and let him wait. Are you selling the forest to Ryabinin? Yes. Do you know him? Of course I know him. I have had dealings with him. Positively and finally. Oblonsky laughed. Positively and finally were the dealer's favorite words. Yes, he does speak very funnily. She knows where the master is going, he added, patting Laska, who was whining and jumping around. Levin, now licking his hand, now his boots and his gun. The trap was standing at the door when they went out. I told them to harness, though it is not far, but if you like we can walk. No, let us drive, said Oblonsky, stepping up into the trap. He sat down, wrapped a rug around his legs, and lit a cigar. How is it you don't smoke a cigar? Is such a you not exactly a pleasure, but the crown and sign of pleasure? Ah, this is life. How delightful this is, how I should like to live. But who prevents you? Levin remarked, smiling. No, you are a lucky fellow. You've got all you are fond of. You like horses, you have them hounds, you have them shooting, you get it farming, you get it too. Perhaps it is because I am glad of what I get, and don't grieve about what I haven't, said Levin, thinking of Kitty. Oblonsky understood and looked at him, but said nothing. Levin was grateful to Oblonsky, because with his usual tact, noticing that Levin was afraid of talking about the Shabatskys, he avoided mentioning them. But now Levin wanted to find out about the matter that tormented him, and yet feared to speak of it. Well, and how are your affairs? He asked, recollecting how wrong it was of him to be thinking only of his own concerns. Oblonsky's eyes began to glitter merrily. But you don't admit that one may want a roll while one gets regular rations. You consider it a crime. And I don't believe in life without love, he answered, understanding Levin's question in his own way. How can I help it? I am made that way, and really so little harm is done to anyone, and one gets so much pleasure. Is there anything new then? Inquired Levin. There is. Will you know Ossian's type of woman, such as one sees in a dream? Well, there are such women in reality, and these women are terrible. Woman you see is an object of such a kind that study it as much as you will. It is always quite new in that case. Better not study them. Oh no, some mathematician has said pleasure lies not in discovering truth, but in seeking it. Levin listened in silence, but in spite of all his efforts, he could not enter into his friend's soul and understand his feeling nor the delight of studying women of that kind. Chapter 15. The place where they were going to shoot was not far away by a stream among young aspen trees. When they had reached the wood, Levin got down and led Oblonsky to the corner of a mossy and marshy glade already free from snow. He himself went to a forked birch on the other side, and leaning his gun against the fork of the lower branch, took off his coat, tightened his girdle, and tried whether he could move his arms freely. The old gray-haired Laska, following close on his heels, sat down wearily in front of him and pricked up Her ears the sun was setting behind the forest, and the little birches interspersed among the aspen trees stood out clearly against the evening glow with their drooping branches and their swollen buds ready to burst into leaf from the thicket. Where the snow had not all melted, the water still flowed in branching streamlets. With a gentle rippling sound, small birds chirped, and then flew from tree to tree in the intervals of profound silence. Last year's leaves were heard rustling, set in motion by the thawing of the earth and the growth of the grass. Just fancy one can hear and see the grass growing, thought Liven as he noticed a wet slate-colored aspen leaf move close to the point of a blade of grass. He stood listening and gazing down, now on the wet mossy ground, now at the attentive Laska, now at the sea of bare treetops stretched out before him at the foot of the hill, and now at the darkening sky streaked with fleecy clouds. A hawk flew leisurely past high above the distant forest. Another followed in the same direction and vanished in the thicket. The birds chirped louder and louder and more eagerly. A tawny owl hooted nearby, and Lasker took a few careful steps, and with her head on one side again, listened intently. A cuckoo called beyond the river. It called twice in its usual note, then hoarsely and hurriedly, and got out of time. Fancy a cuckoo already, said Oblonsky, appearing from behind a bush. Yes, I heard, answered Levin, so reluctant to disturb the silence of the wood that his own voice sounded unpleasant to him. They won't be long now. Oblonsky's figure again disappeared behind the bush, and Jeevan saw the flare of a match followed by the red glow of a cigarette and a spiral of blue smoke. Click, click. Oblonsky cocked his gun. What's that screaming? he asked, drawing Lyavian's attention to a long-drawn cry like the high-pitched whinny of a colt in play. Don't you know it's a male hare? But stop talking, listen, they're coming. Levin almost shouted, cocking his gun. They heard a shrill whistle in the distance, and after the 2 seconds interval so familiar to sportsmen, another followed, and then a third, and after the third whistle came a cry. Levin looked to the right and to the left, and there before him, against the dull light blue sky over the lower branches of the aspen tops, appeared the flying birds. They were flying straight toward him, the near sound of their cry something like the sound made when tightly stretched cloth is steadily torn seemed close to his ears. The long beak and neck of a bird were quite visible, and just as Levin took aim, a red flash came from behind the bush where Oblonsky was standing, and the bird descended like an arrow and then fluttered up again. Another flash followed by a report, and the bird, flapping its wings as if trying to keep up in the air, remained stationary for a moment, and then with a heavy thud fell on the swampy ground. Can I have missed? cried Oblonsky, who could not see through the smoke. Here it is, answered Levin, pointing to Laska, who with one ear erect, wagging her fluffy high-arched tail, stepping slowly as if to prolong the pleasure, and seeming almost to smile, brought the dead bird to her. Master, well, I'm glad you got it, said Levin, and while he spoke he was already experiencing a feeling of envy at not having killed the bird himself. Wretched miss, with the right barrel, replied Oblonsky, reloading. Hush, coming. Indeed they heard two shrill whistles quickly following each other, to snipe playing and racing one another. Whistling, but not crying, flew almost over the sportsmen's heads. Then there were four reports. The birds took a swift turn like swallows and vanished from sight. The shooting was splendid. Oblonsky brought down two more birds, and Levin brought down two, of which one was not recovered. It began to get dark through the young birches. Venus, bright and silvery, was already shining, with her delicate glitter low down in the west, and high up in the east flickered the red fire of the dim Arcturus. Above his head Levin found and again lost stars of the Great Bear. The snipe had ceased flying, but Levin decided to stay until Venus, which he could see underneath a branch, should rise above it, and all the stars of the Great Bear should be visible. Venus had risen above the branch, and the car of the Great Bear, as well as its shafts, showed clearly against the dark blue sky. But he still waited. Is it not time to go? asked Oblonsky. It was quite quiet in the wood, not a bird stirred. Let's stay a little longer, answered Lyavin. As you please. They were now standing some 15 yards apart. Stepan, said Lyavin suddenly and unexpectedly, why don't you tell me whether your sister-in-law is married or when she will be? Levin felt so strong and calm that he thought the answer, whatever it might be, could not agitate him, but he did not at all expect the reply Oblonsky gave him. She has not thought and is not thinking of getting married, but she is very ill and the doctors have sent her abroad. They are even afraid for her life. "You don't mean it," exclaimed Levin, very ill. "What's the matter with her? How did she?" While they were talking, Laska, pricking her ears, kept looking up at the sky, and then reproachfully at them. "What a time they have chosen to talk," thought she, "and there it comes flying, just so. Here it is, they'll miss it." But at that moment both men heard a shrill whistle that seemed to smite on their ears. They both seized their guns, and there were two flashes and two reports. At the same moment the woodcock that was flying high up instantly folded its wings and fell into the thicket, bending down the thin young shoots. "That's good. It belongs to both," cried Levin, and ran into the thicket with Laska to look for the bird. Oh, but there was something unpleasant, he thought. "Yes, of course. Oh, Kitty is ill. But what can I do? I am very sorry," he thought. "Found good dog," he said, taking the warm bird from Laska's mouth and putting it into his well-filled game bag. "We found it, Stepan," he shouted. Chapter 16. On their way home, Levin inquired the particulars of Kitty's illness and of the Chabatskys' plans, and though he would have been ashamed to confess it, what he heard was agreeable to him. It was agreeable because there was still hope for him, and even more because she was suffering, she who had made him suffer so much. But when Oblonsky began to speak of what caused Kitty's illness and to mention Vronsky's name, Levin interrupted him. "I have no right whatever to know such family details, and frankly, I am not interested in them either." Oblonsky gave a scarcely perceptible smile on noticing the quick change so familiar to him in Levin's face, which became as gloomy as it had been bright a moment before. "Have you finally settled with the Ryabinin about the forest?" asked Levin. "Yes, I have. I'm getting a splendid price for it, 38,000 rubles, 8 at once, and the rest to be paid within 6 years. I've been bothering about it a long time. No one would give more. The fact is you are giving the forest away," said Levin moodily. "Why giving away?" said Oblonsky with a good-natured smile, knowing well that everything would now seem wrong to Levin. "Because the forest is worth at least 500 rubles a desiatina," replied Levin. "Oh, you country gentleman," said Blonsky jokingly, "and your tone of contempt for us poor townsfolk. But when it comes to getting business done, we do it better than anyone. Believe me, I have reckoned it all out," continued he, "and have sold the forest so well that I'm afraid he may change his mind. You know it's not timber, but for the most part only fit for fuel," said he, hoping by this remark finally to convince Levin of the injustice of his suspicions. "And it will not yield more than 10 sartsins of wood to the desiatina, and he's paying me at the rate of 200 rubles. Levin smiled contemptuously. "I know this manner," he thought, "not his only, but all townsmen who visit the country 2 or 3 times in 10 years get hold of 2 or 3 expressions, use them in and out of season, and are firmly convinced they know everything timber and yield 10 sartsins. He uses these words, but understands nothing about the business. I should not try to teach you the things you scribble about at your office," he said, "but in case of need would come to you for advice about them. But you are firmly convinced that you understand all this forest, Lawrence. Not easy. Have you counted the trees?" "How can one count the trees?" said Oblonsky, still anxious to dispel his friend's ill humor. "Count grains of sand and planets' rays. Even though a lofty mind were able, well, Rubinian's lofty mind is able to do it, and no dealer will ever buy without first counting, unless the forest is given to him for nothing as you are doing. I know your forest. I go shooting there every year, and it is worth 500 rubles a yatina cash down, and he is paying you 200 on long term. That means that you have made him a present of about 30,000 rubles. Oh, come, don't get so carried away," said Oblonsky pettily. "Why did no one offer more?" "Because he and the other dealers are in league, and he has bought them off. I've had dealings with them all, and I know them. They're not genuine dealers, but sharks. He would not consider a deal which would bring him in 10 or 15%. He waits till he can buy at a fifth of the value. Oh, come, you are down in the dumps today." "Not at all," said Levin gloomily. Just as they drove up to the house, at the porch stood a little cart strongly bound with leather and iron, and to the cart was harnessed a well-fed horse with broad, tightly stretched straps. In the cart sat Ryabinin's clerk, who also performed a coachman's duties, his skin tightly stretched over his full-blooded face, and his belt drawn tight. Ryabinin himself was already in the house and met the two friends in the hall. He was a tall, spare, middle-aged man with a mustache, a prominent shaven chin, and prominent dim eyes. He wore a long-skirted blue coat with buttons very low down at the back, high boots drawn quite straight over the calves of his legs and crinkled round the ankles, and over them he had on a pair of large Galoshes wiped his face all round with his handkerchief and smoothing his coat, which was already quite in order, smilingly greeted the new arrivals. He held out his hand to Oblonsky, as if he were trying to catch something. "Oh, so you've come," said Oblonsky, taking his hand. "That's right, I dared not disobey your Excellency's commands, though the roads are quite too bad. I have literally had to walk all the way. But I have arrived in time. Constantly, Demetrius, my respect to you," he said, turning to Levin and trying to catch his hand too. But Levin, frowning, pretended not to see the hand and began taking the snip out of the game bag. "You've been pleased to amuse yourself with shooting. What kind of bird may that be?" added Ryabinin, looking contemptuously at the snipe. "Something tasty," and he shook his head disapprovingly, as if much doubting whether this game were worth the candle. "Would you like to go into my study?" said Levin, frowning moodily and addressing Oblonsky in French. "Go into the study. You can talk things over there." "That would do very well, or wherever you like," remarked Ryabinin with contemptuous dignity, as if to show them that though others might find it difficult to know how to behave with different people, yet for him no difficulty of any kind could ever exist. On entering the study, Ryabinin looked around by force of habit, as though to find the icon. But after finding it, he did not cross himself. He glanced at the book cupboards and bookshelves with the same look of doubt as he had bestowed on the snip, smiled contemptuously, and again shook his head disapprovingly, decidedly refusing to admit that this game could be worth the candle. "Well, have you brought the money?" asked Oblonsky. "Well, take a seat. There won't be any difficulty about the money. I've come to see you, and to talk matters over. We'll talk what matters over. But do take a seat." "I can do that," said Ryabinin, sitting down and putting his arm on the back of his chair in a most uncomfortable way. "You must let me off something, Prince. You're wronging me. As to the money, it is already to the last kopeck. There'll be no delay about the money." Yevgen, who had been putting away his gun in a cupboard, was just going out of the door. But on hearing the dealer's words, he stopped. "As is, you're getting the forest for next to nothing," he said. "He came to me too late, else I would have fixed the price." Ryabinin rose and smiled silently, surveying Levin from his feet to his head. "He's very close as Constantine Demetrius," he said, addressing Oblonsky with a smile. "It's absolutely impossible to buy anything of him. I've been bargaining with him for weeks and offering a good price. Why should I give you what is mine for nothing? I have not found it on the ground nor stolen it. Oh dear, no. Nowadays it is quite impossible to steal. Absolutely everything nowadays goes before a jury. Everything is judged honorably. There's no possibility of stealing. Oh, we speak honestly. It's too much for the forest. There's no making any profit on it. I'm asking to have something knocked off. If only a trifle. Well, have you settled the business or not? If you have, there's no use bargaining. But if not," said Levin, "I will buy the forest myself."